Are you under? Do I look beautiful? Okay, are we good to start? Or should I wait? All right. Are you guys ready to start? Yeah. All right. Welcome to the 18th annual FlowTex. Woohoo! Thanks for joining us. Also want to point out he's not sitting in the room right now, but it is Rui's birthday. We'll be talking second. So when you see him, make sure you wish him a happy birthday. We have a great little talk for you to. Oh, I want to thank. Oh, there's Rui. Happy birthday, everyone. Yay! We have a really great organizing committee that helps put this talk on. So go ahead and thank all those people who help us put on FlowTex. So thank you, everyone. Yay. We also service a lot more than just you Texas folks who are sitting here, but we service lots of countries across the globe as well as states across the United States. So thank you for all of you turning in from outside of the US and outside of Texas. Our program is pretty awesome this year. We're going to have a panel design, a little innovation session hosted by some of the companies that you see outside, instrument and analysis session, followed on Wednesday by our typical clinical session, which is awesome. A lot of fun, exciting science on Wednesday, followed on Thursday by an awesome career networking session. Brian Krushan from NASA talking, our emerging scientists, and more science, specifically on overnight staining. So if you guys haven't checked out overnight staining, come back on Thursday to listen about that. Our conference is sponsored by a whole bunch of sponsors, all of our vendors near and far. So thank you everyone for putting on this conference. If you want to interact with our speakers and you're here presently, feel free to stand up and ask a question. You can also log into YouTube and type a question into the comments section. Both are great ways to interact with us. If you're interested in joining the organizing committee, we are always looking for volunteers and a helping hand. So feel free to email any one of us and we'll add you to the list. If you do need continuing education credits, make sure that you email David at the end of the conference and let him know that you are here so that you can get your continuing education credits. And then here's our schedule a little bit more in-depthly, but some housekeeping things for those of you that need to use the bathroom. The bathroom is behind the registration table, so feel free to check that out for the bathrooms. And then if you brought your own water bottle and you'd like to refill your water bottle, you can do that behind the security desk. And there will be, unfortunately, a few talks that will not be streaming due to restrictions, but we are happy to inform you that most of our talks will be streamed and recorded. So we're going to go into our daily program and open up with a little panel design session. So I'll hand it off to Ville, who will introduce those speakers.
Good morning, everybody. On my behalf, I'm Ville Meredith, and I'm one of the organizers of this conference and the vendor liaison if anybody needs to contact me on that side. It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, David Haviland. He's one of our original FlowTex committee members, organizers, the past president of the FlowTex. He started flow cytometry already in the 80s. And apparently it was EPIC's 5 instrument at that time. Studied some CD44 positive T cells that people didn't really know what they are at that time. Moved to here to Houston and was actually long time responsible of flow cytometry instruments in this very building. But nowadays he's working at the Methodist Research Institute and is a flow core manager or they're responsible of flow cytometry and cell sorting at Methodist Research Institute. He will be speaking today about the multicolor panels and giving kind of introduction to multicolor flow cytometry and panel design. Please welcome. Okay, it's there already open. Yes.
All right. Thank you very much, Philly, for the introduction. I have never, this is a new one for me. I have never opened a conference, never been the first speaker at a conference, so this will be fun. As I say down here that it's hidden, you are more than welcome to take pictures of anything you see on the screen. I have no problem with that. Okay. Primer for multicolor flow cytometry, yes. We thought about this when we were talking about it in the committee, and we thought it'd be a good idea to broach it so that everybody's got a common basis. And hopefully I will form the basis of, or the foundation for the next two speakers, as well as some of the other things. So in a way, this will be Dora the Explorer, Curious George meets flow cytometry to start with. So we give you water wings in the shallow end of the pool, and then by the time you're into the next speaker, you're going to be in the deep end of the pool. So that's kind of my idea on how to make this work. So you look around the room, everybody in this room has had prior flow experiences, had to face that awful decision that makes you rethink your life choices. What is that life choices? Oh my God, I have to add a second or third color to my flow cytometry experiment. What do I do? That's basically where I'm starting from. The first thing you need to do is determine what color you might want to use and where do you start. So you need to know what sort of lasers and detectors you have on the instruments to which you have access. What are you trying to do? What's the hypothesis? What's the question? How many lasers does that instrument have? Yes, in a way, it's sort of an instrument-specific question. What are the filters in front of the PMTs you have access to? Fluorochrome assignments, you want to set it up, you want to smoke test it a few times. So you're going to see it on a number of slides. Multicolor flow is not easy. It takes time to get it going. Now, I'm going to try to give you some shortcuts toward the end, but we'll go from there. Sample quality digression. The quality of what you put into a cytometer is in direct relation to what you're going to get out of it. We all love flow cytometry, but at its minimalistic basis, flow cytometers are high precision particle counters, glorified particle counters. That's all they do. And it's a question of what you put into the machine. What kind of particles? Do you put cell debris or do you put cells? And that's going to be a direct reflection of what you get out of the machine. So if you put in nice, happy live cells, you're going to get nice, happy, hopefully good quality data coming out of the machine. If, however, you sneak this in there, do not expect your Nobel Prize winning experiment to come out of the machine because it's just simply not going to happen. As I said, they're over-glorified particle counters. Garbage in, garbage out. So you have to make sure of what it takes for you to make sure that what you're bringing to the machine is as much live cells as possible. Your core staff can look at your forward and side profiles and know very well how well you treat your cells and whether or not something like cellular protective services need to be called. If your sample is compromised in any way, do not expect your rare markers such as cytokines, intercellular cytokines, FOXP3, 127, CCR7, those lovely, sexy things to show up because that's not going to happen, particularly if the cells haven't been frozen right. I refer you to two pre-recorded talks by Karen Dreyer, who are on our YouTube FlowTex page about sample quality going into the sorter. And also, I recall Kathy Daniels I think was here 2 years ago, and also talked about the nuances of sample preparation to make sure that what you're putting in is over there. I eliminated a slide where I have somebody's sort from our core, 45 minutes from T0 to 45 minutes, and there's a complete world of difference and change. In fact, most of his cells died as they were going over the machine, and it turns out that he kept them in nothing but PBS. And I tell him it's going to die in PBS. The cells are going to start dying after about 15 minutes. So you got to give them some food and things to feed on. So throughout this conference, and especially in the next couple of seminars this morning, you may hear two terms: compensation and spectral unmixing. Purists may throw eggs, golf balls, and apples at me, but in effect, they are the same thing. And we are trying, and the end result is you don't want to have colors in the experiment interfering with each other. The goal is to eliminate spillover from one channel into another. So you will hear both these terms, compensation and spectral unmixing. I'm taking a little liberty with that. When we start out in Flow, we always give you the simple version. Then there's really an intermediate version, and then there's the truth. And then people who understand the truth said, why did you start over here? Because we have to with flow cytometry. It's not always easy. All right, a traditional flow cytometer, these are off the BD spectrum viewer, by the way. A traditional flow cytometer is going to have, say, off 488, you've got FITC and PE, is going to have your basic bandpass filters. A spectral instrument, A5, the Aurora, others that are out there, the S8 and the A8, will actually take into account the entire spectrum. They don't use PMTs, they use what are called avalanche detectors. And each of these emission profiles is almost a fingerprint to the fluorochrome that you're using. And they can separate the spectra based on the entire spectra that they see. An extension of that is some instruments that I happen to have one. I happen to have the BDA5. What it does is it starts from the laser and goes all the way up to 800 nanometers. Forgive me, I just got tired of drawing boxes after about the sixth one. But actually, I would be having boxes all the way up. And what these represent would be bandpass filters, very narrow bandpass filters to, in effect, get a snapshot of the spectrum. And it's somewhat complementary to this. All right, know your colors. This is again off the legacy BD spectrum viewer, 488, FITC, PE, PERSI, PE, Sci 7. Let's talk a little bit about channels and detectors. In older times, before about the year 2000, FL1 almost always meant FITC. Not anymore. Those FL designations are largely obsolete. If you see an FL designation in a recent paper, that's a warning sign. That's a warning sign that the authors are not taking care and consideration to present their data correctly, and you need to actually look at the data with a little bit more skepticism. Even still, FL1, the old traditional FITC filter, had a 530/30 standard FITC filter in front of it. You could see FITC, GFP, YFP, I think surveillance, CFP, CFSC, Alexa 488. So no longer does FL1 just mean one color. Channel parameters in the listings is fading away. Some of us now are adapting around some of the spectral instruments, and if some of us have started flipping our machines over to this new nomenclature. So we need you to know what you're working with. I can't tell you how many times I've been sitting in the car waiting. Hey, good, glad to see you. Here's my sample. Okay, what is it? It's orange. Really? Do you know I can get orange out of all 5 lasers? Can you go back to your lab and define what orange is? So here's where we need our users to understand and comprehend what they're working with. So in this case now, some of us are starting to memorize. Mouse, where'd you go? B510, FITC, yellow-green 585 is PE, APC, DAPI, brilliant violet 421 or PAC blue. We start working along that line. We've developed a cheat sheet for our A5, as I'm sure many of the other cores have. We go only by the detector. I can't add all these because there are over 200, 300 plus colors. I'll talk about that shortly. more colors actually than that. We can't have all of these colors listed in the machine parameters because you'll be wading through just trying to find FITSI. I have people on a Fortessa that get perplexed when they see Alexa 488 and they're working with GFP and it's right under the same tab. So making things simpler is always better. So our newer instruments that we have are running this sort of a scheme here, depending on all the lasers that you have. Need a Spectra in a hurry? Firefox or Chrome at the top of the browser. I strongly advise you to play with the BD one, the Life Technology ones. It includes also eBiosciences as well as molecular probes. BioLegend and Chroma filters as well. The easiest is Google the company name and put in Spectral Viewer. This isn't for panel design yet, but just to get your hands wrapped around a Spectral Viewer, you need to know what colors are talking to each other, and I'll be showing that to you in a little bit. I'm talking about them when I transition over to panel builders. Peanut gallery, tell you, All right. So you come up with a boatload of colors. Now, this is just BD. Understand, I'm not trying to slight BioLegend or Thermo Fisher, Cytec, or anybody who's developing colors, Thermo Fisher as well. Brilliant UVs, brilliant violets. You throw in Rogerson's fruit vectors. You throw in the dreaded Q dots, brilliant violets, dye lights, Alexa fluors. Oh, one typo there. Brilliant UVs, brilliant blues, and others, and everything else that's in the molecular probes catalog. Then there are more colors than we know what to do with. So that's why coming into the course saying it's orange is absolutely useless. Maybe around 2000, 1999, 2000, 2001, there were 6 colors we used in flow cytometry, and every core personnel had them all memorized. Those days are gone, absolutely gone. We need users to know what they're working with. Okay, just how many dyes are out there? Per fluorofinder, they've got 12 pages listed with about 100 fluors per page. Does this mean we have 1,200 fluors? No, not really. Usually what happens is a company makes a dye and then licenses that dye to multiple companies to make their antibodies. So in the case, a dye gets licensed for use by three monoclonal suppliers. The rub is they all call it something different for their own purposes when in fact they're the same chemical. Case in point, PE Sci-5 came out just before I actually forget when PE Sci-5 came out, but it came out with 4 names: Cychrome, R670, Trichrome, and Quantum Red. Pretty sure Tricolor was the one that I bought when I was buying it from Sigma at the time. So a number of these things have the same, pretty much are the same thing. An email chat with Kelly Lunston. She feels there's probably about 225 separate colors out there that can all, but some of them can be pigeonholed into about 35 to 40 channels. So let's go back. As I said, this is a primer, compensation. Let's talk about it and why the concern. This is an experiment that I actually did for my analyzer talk. I think I may have even generated the data upstairs. This is U937 cells stained with CD44. I conjugated it, isolated the antibody, conjugated it myself back in the day. No PE reagent is used. So your FITSI emission is sitting at about 520. PE emission is sitting at about 585. The $64 question is, why am I getting this signal? And you notice there's a pattern similarity. Probably immature ones starting to grow, the main population up here, but you see basically the same profile, but it is shifted to the left by about a three-quarters of a log. There is no signal in PE, and the problem where you're getting that is here. All of our fluors that we deal with have a peak emission, and then they have a lower energy, long wavelength tail that extends off to the right. So in this case here, you can actually see that FITSI is tickling well into this very broad PE channel. PE, if bright enough, and PE is one of the brighter ones out there, can tickle back into FITSI, and that happens periodically. So taken together, you have this. Let's do a real example that I used to do. Used to actually have students run. These are Jurkat cells, unstained, class 1 FITSI, CD3 PE. And I got a little bit of an edge here, and I will admit, for the rigor and reproducibility that'll make them cringe. This was manually compensated, but I could probably take a little bit of an edge off that population. It's reasonably comped. You could put your dreaded quad stats and get your percentages. Over here is the very same data, the compensation zeroed out. What you're seeing here is that arrowhead kind of pointing into that lower left corner, giving a hallmark characteristic that compensation was not taken into account in this experiment. We see this in publications far more than we need to, far more than we should. So education is on us to try to prevent this type of stuff from coming out of our course. So let's start super simple. Someone comes to my core wanting to add a second color to their GFP transgenic cell. I got FITSI. My immediate recommendation is APC. Okay, we've added 2 colors. Are we taking compensation into account? Yes, we're seeing if those 2 colors play with each other. And you can pretty much be rest assured by these two snapshots. FITSI does not tickle APC, and the 488 does not tickle, doesn't back tickle FITSI. So this would be a reasonably good two color experiment to do. It's one I usually recommend when somebody wants to check something on their transfection. Now, as long as you have access to separate lasers, a third color could be PE. A simple 4-color experiment, actually, that I've recommended is put 1 color on each laser, each separate laser. Sure, there may be some compensation crosstalk, but by having the colors on separate lasers, the compensation matrix will be easier to work with. So you can get 2, 3, 4 colors if you've got a multicolor system without too much problem. So in this example, I would have, say, PAC blue, FITSI, PE, and APC. Yeah, they're going to crosstalk down here, but if you take the little boxes I had about 4 slides ago and put bandpass filters, you're going to see that the crosstalk between those channels is going to be minimal. So you always need to bring your single color controls, same color, and they must work. I don't know about other core folk, but I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, can I use FITSI as my compensation control for GFP? No, absolutely not. So let's make a mess and see where to go. This is again off the BD Spectral Viewer. It is not a panel builder, so in no way, shape, or form am I throwing shade on BD for presenting the data this way. But hopefully what you see is a colossal mess. All off 488, FITSI, PE, 7AAD for viability. Whatever the marker is, PE Sci5, PE Sci5.5, and PE Sci7, this is a colossal mess. Friendly, colloquially, I would say I don't even want to turn on the machine to run this panel because this is fraught with failure. We get presented with panels that users want to use. And sometimes those panels are just an outright disaster. Let's not do this. I'm not even going to belabor this down here. I will describe those later on. But right off the top, my first thing is, can we get rid of 7AAD? 7AAD to me is the blobfish when it comes to emissions because he just basically blows things away. This panel will come back when I dive into FluoroFinder. My next suggestion in this case would be, let's bail PE Sci5 because now you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 relatively separate signals, and that's okay. You could bail a PE Sci5 and keep the 5.5, but you're going to have some crosstalk here. But also notice something back here, PE Sci7, and both of them are all back tickling into PE. Why? Antibody. How they make it? They put the PE on, then they put the Sci7 on. They don't put the PE Sci7 as a complete conjugate on. They do it as a 2-step reaction stemming from the antibody out. So in all of your tandem dyes, there will always be a small amount of the base molecule. In this case, in PE Sci7, PE Sci5.5, and PE Sci5, there will always be a small amount of antibody that's still just only coupled to PE. And if nobody's told you, your tandems are usually not stable to freezing. I had somebody freeze thaw PE Sci5 3 times when they moved from Harvard to this institute. And golly gee whiz, it was 100% PE. The Sci was gone. So here's another one that I occasionally get hit with. Off the red laser, APC, Alexa 4700, APC Sci7. This is at least workable, but my immediate recommendation is, can we bail that Alexa 4700? Lux 4700 is actually not the brightest kid on the block. So if you can move it to something else, let's do that. Understand multicolor flow is not easy. All of a sudden, you've got to pay attention to overlapping colors. Antibody color availability is your favorite molecule and available in the color you want. Antigen density, we need to match the brightest fluorophore with the dimmest marker. If you're looking at intercellular cytokines, FOXP3, things like that, that's a separate conversation. I have an asterisk on that, so I've got slides coming up, another slide coming up on it. Quality of cell preparation, as I mentioned earlier, between the forward and side. Frozen, how well were they frozen? Were they frozen off? I'm going to say this. A lot of labs still may have that bottle of DMSO on the shelf that's been there for a year and they still use it and it works fine for the tumor cells, but for the real sensitive cells, not so much. It's going to compromise your sample. We learned very early on when we were doing transgenic work, those 1 mil ampules of DMSO that are sealed under nitrogen from Sigma for one single use only were the best way to freeze cells. So antibody titration, strongly recommended, single color controls for every color. And we still wrongly, I feel like I'm fighting tilting at a windmill, still trying to get people to use viability dyes. So let's dive in. This is off the net. Well, website's right up here. This is a thing that takes into account quantum yield, brightness intensity, and assigns a relative brightness. Kelly Lunston had one that was graphed, laid out from dim to bright, and had them on a relative scale. I kind of like this one because it's all there. PE, Brilliant Violet, APC, Sci-5 are all up here in the 5s. Then we come down to slightly a little bit dimmers, 4s. Then we come into the 3s, 2s, 1s, and then we come into the, who knows, down here. Q dots, live dead. Some of those do not stain very well, and that's okay because you're going to be, a lot of those you're going to be gating on the negative cells. A lot of your Alexa floors. This is something you need to consider. So if you have, I need to go back a slide because I forgot a point. If you have something dim, you want to be looking up here to have that. Let me slide back to this guy. Okay. Single parameter histogram. If you've got pretty much negative down here, you need to assess the relative density of your favorite molecule. If it's on FITSI and it's sliding out here, chances are, just a subjective assessment, your relative antigen density is probably pretty good. If it's back over here, down here next to your negative control, chances are it may not be highly expressed on your cells, and this is where you may need to pick a brighter floor. You may need to pick one of these up here for your favorite molecule in order to be able to see it, because we have something else that we talk about, spread of the data. The more colors you add, the more the data is going to spread, and if you have negative and you have something positive that's just barely off the shoulder of the negative population, the more colors you add, the more of these are going to start sliding into each other to the point where this population may not be detected. You may walk away thinking it's negative when in fact, no, it's there, but you just did not select the right fluorochrome for that. And you need a fluorochrome that's going to position it further out here. Speaking of viability dyes, I'm not going to go into the weeds, too much on the weeds on this, but singlet F is a marker that is unique to eosinophils. CD3, of course, is unique to T cells, and never the two shall meet. But without a viability dye, you get your amazing publishable double positive population that is not really there. If you work it through a viability dye, which is why we always encourage those, you now get a background level that's at least as appreciable. Again, multicolor flow is not easy. All of a sudden, you need to pay attention to your single color controls. For each one that you use, you've got to bring a single color control to the core. If you've got 10 colors with the unstained, you're automatically running 11 tubes before you even get to your sample. Think about that before you decide to design a 15 or 18 color panel. If you have to include FMOs, fluorescence -1, I said this is a primer, so I'm going to be describing that in a little bit of detail. Those are extra controls you need to run once your compensation spectral mixing is undone. And as a gentle reminder, all of your tubes have to be collected on the same voltages and same compensation settings. Otherwise, you're not showing the PI an honest experiment. So very briefly, FMO, isotypes have been found to gravely mislead researchers, as we know. They don't account for the spread of the data, which is what I show over here. CD8, E4 710, CD4, BV 750. This is good up here. This guy is spreading off here for a little bit. Though adequately compensated, the problem is anything, you won't have a double positive here, of course, but because of the spread of the data in an ideal world, you cannot really assess anything much above the tip of below the tip of the arrow as positive because of the spread. To narrow this down, you might need to change that color. So coming back, isotypes can help assess the nonspecific binding, but shouldn't be used to define the negative control. I'm sure you're going to hear about FMOs later today and later in the conference. So let's say your experiment has 5 colors and one is FOXP3. You're going to have an unstained control, 5 separate comp controls, and the control for FOXP3 is going to have everything but the PE. That's why it's called a fluorescence -1 control. You have to run a fluorescence -1 control on your entire panel. I usually don't recommend it, and some may differ, and that's fine. I recommend on the molecules you are really interested in and on dim things that are of interest. Use your resources, colleagues. It's okay to ask other people. I might ask Sarah something, and then I immediately turn around and ask Joel something, and Sarah might take offense. Well, didn't David take my point of view? No. Yeah, but that's okay. But here, when I talk about multicolor, I actually encourage it. Talk to my tech, talk to Ellie, see what she comes up with. Then talk to me, see what I come up with. And the 3 of us put our heads together and try to streamline a panel. Talk to your core staff, talk to your people at BioLegend, BD, Cytec, Thermo Fisher, Beckman Coulter, Web Tools to help with panel design. They want you to buy the antibody, so they're going to offer the service. Yeah, they may bias the suggestion toward their product line, but that's okay. Tech services supplied with those companies can be of value. FluoroFinder, I'm going to talk a little bit about FluoroFinder because many of the cores are tied to it. I know there are other panel builders out there. My core in particular is tied with FluoroFinder, and it's been pretty good. Try not to reinvent the wheel. OMIPS in Cytometry Part A, that stands for Optimized Color Immunofluorescence Panel. There are dozens of OMIPs out there. You just got to find the one that's most applicable to what you're doing. Previously published work, I'll bring that up later. Companies' pre-made panels. So, and I'm just picking on Cytec. You've got vendors out there. You've got Cytec, you're going to have BioLegend, Thermo Fisher, BD, and if I'm dropping someone, I apologize. Go see what kind of panels they have. In this case, an 8-color panel here from Cytec. It's already QC'd to death. Yes, you're going to pay for it, but your time and money are worth. Your time is worth a little bit of money as well. So a kit like this may save you time because it could help jumpstart it because they've QC'd all the colors. Let's slide up here. Cytec C4 14-color kit. Do you need to use all of these in an experiment? No. If you don't need CCR7 or CD19 or 127, you can leave them out. Or I could say CD127, see how bright this is on the brightness scale. As long as I keep this color the same, I could possibly substitute my favorite molecule in there. I was not able to find it. I tried, but I do recall companies offering multicolor panels and then 2 slots for what are called drop-ins, or you could pigeonhole whatever you want. Use that in your favor. You don't have to use every color here, but understand in the process of generating this kit, they've QC'd this kit and have tried to make the compensation aspect easier. So I don't want you to reinvent the wheel. Let's go back to that horrible panel. Remember this one? FITSI, PE, 7AAD, and then I think I've got per-CP Sci 5.5. I'm not throwing shade on BD. What I was showing you was the spectral viewer. I can do anything I want in that. Here, this is a panel building tool from FluoroFinder. What it did was the minute I picked 7AAD, it took PE Sci 5 and PE Sci 5.5 off the table. I can't access them. The only way I can access them is if I take 7AAD out of the picture. What it also gives you is something of a bit more use down here. This is a 5x5 matrix with the colors that I show here. You will see matrices in this meeting that will fill the screen. You'll probably see 18, 20 by 20 matrices. I have no idea what Rui and Peter Mage are going to show. or for what's in the rest of the conference. But as I said, we're going to keep this simple because this is a primer. Skip the diagonal. What 7AD does with 7AD, I really don't care. When you see this, what you want to do, eliminate the diagonal. You want to pay attention to what is above and below that 45 degree, or below that diagonal line. Personally, I get curious about anything that's 20% or higher. Can we find another color? Can we work this out? Can we do it? Can we work it a little bit differently? Let's try a slightly bigger one. This is an 8 color, so I'm showing you an 8x8 matrix. Again, ignore the diagonal. FluoroFinder in this case will highlight the ones you really need to pay attention to. CD44 Brilliant Violet 510 with Brilliant Violet 421. Those are cross-talking upwards about 50%. This is something you might need to consider. I just threw the panel. This was a panel that came to the core, by the way. Higher complexity indicates substantial similarity between selected fluorophores, which may be difficult to optimize, while a lower complexity index indicates a more efficient panel. This one is sitting here smoking at a 10. The idea is you want to try to work this down a little bit. If you take a fluorochrome off, the nifty thing of FluoroFinder is it will suggest a fluorochrome for you that will hopefully be a little bit more compatible with your panel. The advantage with FluoroFinder is that it takes everybody's inventory into account. So it will mix and match. You can get this antibody from Thermo Fisher, this one from BioLegend, this one from BD, this one from someplace else, and you can go from there. Standardizing immunophenotyping for human immunology project. I don't know about other FlowCore people, but I have a love-hate relationship with this paper. I love Holden Maker to death, but this paper has caused some gastrointestinal angst. The good side, T cells, regs, Th1s, DC monocytes, what have you, B cells, has already got this fairly well established. Compensation is worked out and it's good to go. My problem is I have people coming and handing me this paper in my office and say, this is what my PI wants to do. Why does he want to do it? What's the question? What's the hypothesis? Are you looking at activated, unactivated, normal versus diseased? No, he just thought it'd be a good idea. Aha, he's on a fishing expedition. What do you know about this organ system, the immunology system? Not much. Immunochemistry? Nope. Flow cytometry? Nope. Sample preparation? Nope. Now I have to sit there and educate a user in immunochemistry, immunology, flow cytometry, tissue preparation, all the way up. And that's where this has been good and it's also been good, well, not so good. So again, we encourage users to try to learn more about what they're actually doing. All right, don't know where I am as far as time, but last slide. As I've said now, multicolor flow is not easy. Make every effort to use those panel building tools from FluoroFinder, Thermo Fisher. They all have them. They're all coming up. You need to spend time figuring them out. Go off prior publications, OMIPs, panels that the companies offers. Start talking to them out there. Start there. Please try every effort not to invent the wheel. I've got 2 little quick anecdotes. I have somebody who came to the core over a year ago with an entirely homegrown panel. And we looked at it and it was like 14 colors. And I kid you not, 10 of those colors were 650 nanometers on up off the UV, yellow, green, and the red laser. And I just said, dude, I don't even want to turn on the machine for this. This is setting you up for failure. Let's talk about moving some of these colors. And after some exchanges and going through FluoroFinder, we were able to come to a consensus on a decent panel. At the same time, I don't see said individual in this room, but I had a graduate student come to my core about 10 years ago when needing to do an 11-color pediatric immunophenotyping panel. We did not have the BD Spectral viewer. We did not have FluoroFinder. We had no panel design tools. The only thing we had was our respective expertise that we brought to the table to come up with this 11-color panel that she eventually ended up smoke testing on normal blood and then was able to start the process of working her way through all the pediatric frozen samples, which were frozen relatively well. She was able to get good data out of it. But it was 11 colors without the use of a panel building tool. Sometimes when you talk to a fisherman, every time they tell the story, the fish keeps getting bigger. So this is no fish story. I say we, it was more like about 3%, 97%. She was constantly in the core. We were going over things, swapping antibodies left and right. It took us 3.5 months to develop that 11 color panel. So that's why I've said for about the 4th time, multicolor flow is not easy. You want to jumpstart it? Go to a predetermined panel that's been QC'd to death, where you can maybe make a substitution or two. That would be your fastest way. But you come to me with a homegrown panel and you need the data next week, it's probably not going to happen. All right. Thank you for your time. I hope that was a decent enough primer, and I'm more than happy to bluff my way through any questions. Oh, okay. Not a problem.
Thank you, David. How do I advance this forward, Sarah? There we go. Okay. Let him hook up.
Do it. If you just share it.
It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, and I'll start by wishing him a happy birthday again. Rui began his scientific career just before graduating in biochemistry in 1997 as a trainee in mathematical biology. In 2004, he earned his PhD in biomedical sciences, for which most of the work was carried out in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at the University of Michigan, but also USC and the Gulbenkian Institute of Science in Portugal. At the end of 2006, Rui became the flow cytometry core facilities manager at the Gulbenkian Institute. And in June of 2016, Rui became the director of the flow cytometry core facility at MSKCC in New York. Driven by a sense of responsibility toward his peers and the community, Rui has been actively involved in ISAC since 2007 and elected to ISAC Council from 2012 to 2016. He led the first ISAC SRL Oversight Committee involved in the development and improvement of these programs from 2014 to 2016. He's an avid teacher and trainer in flow cytometry, lecturing courses and workshops around the world and providing state-of-the-art content in polychromatic, spectral, and imaging flow cytometry. He's currently a member of ISAC's Live Education Subcommittee and the FlowTex Committee. Today, Rui is going to talk about some of the flow cytometry tools his core is developing to improve research. Welcome, Rui Gardner.
Thank you. Just going to connect, please. Right. Showing up there. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the very kind introduction. For me, it's I always say this, it's an enormous pleasure to be at FlowTex. This is a partnership that MSK and FlowTex have started right after the pandemic. And it's been a ride. We've done so many things together. And so to keep coming here, belonging to the FlowTex committee, et cetera, is always a huge pleasure. And the cherry on top of the cake is to be also introduced by Cardler, another partnership that started also right after the pandemic. So for me, it's a huge pleasure, to be here, and in my birthday also. So thank you very much for all the kind words and introductions. So today, I'm going to talk to you about, as Carla said, some tools that we've been developing in our core to improve flow cytometry research. In this case, this was another concept or idea that started also here at FlowTex. It was actually in San Antonio in Carla's lab where FlowTex was helping Cytec develop some of the kits that they started selling commercially. And it was this idea of a backbone panel. And actually, as David mentioned, the concept of drop-ins and being able to, so with these kits, at least with the spaces that were open, there was a possibility of adding drop-ins. And we really started thinking of that idea as something that we could apply for our own core and our own researchers. And so most of the data and the work that I'm presenting today was actually developed by Anna Longini, who is now working for Sony. But as I said, most of the work here was developed by her. So I'm really excited to present this to you guys. And basically, it's the development of a mouse spectral backbone panel that we're using for immune surveillance in normal and complex tumor tissues. Of course, being in a cancer center, it was very important to develop something that would be we would be able to use in complex tumor tissues. So to give you a little bit of context, essentially, our core facility is a high-paced facility, institution. We have been slowly introducing spectral instruments and trying to convert all the spectral instruments. You may say, maybe it's not that slow, but we have been trying to introduce a lot of, replacing the old instruments, the conventional polychromatic instruments, into spectral solutions that people can use in our core facility. So as you can see here, we have already mostly, actually, we'll just have we're just waiting for another fax discovery assay to replace for one of the areas. So essentially, we'll have 4 spectral sorters, spectrally enabled sorters, and another 6 conventional sorters. Same thing with the analyzers. We have 7 analyzers. At the moment, we have 3 spectral, and also moving as much as possible as the other instruments become obsolete and no longer have support. We are replacing them with spectral solution. You can see here that we have around 700 users from 250 labs. So although high parameter spectral flow cytometry is still and will probably continue being somewhat of a niche in the sense that the percentage is very low compared to the amount of people that use flow cytometry. But still, from all of these labs, we do have a lot of demand for panel design. Just for you to have a notion of the amount of work we do with our users, we do around 350 assisted sorts a month, plus another 200 unassisted sorts a month. So we're typically engaged highly, as I said, in a high pace with a lot of users demanding high quality flow cytometry services. And also for you to have an idea in terms of high parameter flow cytometry, we work at least on average developing about 25 to 30 panels a year with something between 6 and 25 markers. And as David said, it's not easy to do multicolor flow cytometry or multi-parameter flow cytometry. And so we started thinking of ways to be able to offer panel design services in an efficient way. So one of our concerns is essentially also with vendors developing their own solutions for panel design and offering these many of them for free. It was starting to drive our users to look for these solutions, but we knew that they weren't going to have the full support throughout the whole process in the way that we could provide, right? So we wanted to provide a really good, high quality service to our users, making sure we were company agnostic in the sense, like David also mentioned, some of these vendors will want to obviously sell their reagents, so they'll provide a panel essentially built with their own reagents, which makes sense. But we were trying to be as much company agnostic as possible to really provide the best solution out there, whatever company or commercially available antibodies are out there. We wanted to try to find the best. Also, in terms of providing the latest knowledge on the biological markers. So I started a few years ago to hire individuals with immunology background, and Anna was one of the first that we hired in that sense. And we have already a few other staff members that have expertise in immunology, so that we could provide also together in a collaborative manner with our researchers the best panel, not only in terms of commercially available antibodies, as I mentioned, but also in terms of understanding which are the best markers to use, so that we're not wasting time developing large panels that will compromise the quality of the data with markers that are actually not as important as one would think at first. And I mean, you would, I don't know if you would be surprised or not, at least if you work in the core, you wouldn't be surprised that a lot of the immunology researchers actually don't have that much knowledge in the biological markers that they need to use, sometimes because they're just, given this task, and they have to quickly perform this task without having much time to really dive into the immunology details. Also, another thing that was very important was for us to be able to provide, and I think here's where we could really stand out compared to what else is out there in terms of panel design services, is that we can, with our users, we can follow them from the beginning, from the conceptually helping them design the panel, and then troubleshooting the panel. Again, like David said, there's a lot of work into developing and validating a panel. And we wanted to make sure that we would go through all that process, including helping with titration, setting up the instrument, finding the right instrument, but also then helping with data analysis. So we could support our users, we can support our users throughout this whole process, which I think is something that stands out regarding the other services that are provided. And then, as I mentioned, we wanted also to make sure that we could support with data analysis, and that is something that in this concept of a backbone panel also helped us a lot, as I'll explain in a moment, in terms of streamlining and improving the quality of data analysis. So the idea that we had was also based on the fact that you could ask, well, you have a lot of panels already out there. Like David mentioned, go to the literature, you have OMIBs. And in fact, there is a lot of data out there already, panels that were developed for mouse immune surveillance. The thing is, most of them are developed for conventional flow cytometry, which depends highly on the actual optical configuration that the people that published the panel had. So they're not really universal in that sense. But there are also already some spectral panels out there, also for immune surveillance. But a lot of these panels are really very comprehensive. You have like 30-something color panels, 40 color panels. And then every time our researchers approached us, there was always some slight changes, 3-4 markers that they had to change. And that if you start changing those big panels, you realize that you actually have to start thinking of everything from scratch, right? So essentially, we're building new panels all the time and wasting a lot of time and reinventing the wheel. And this is another example of some of the panels that we were being asked to develop. And you can see from here, from these 5 panels, just as an example, there are at least all of these markers that are present in all of these 5 panels. These are present in at least 4 of these 5 panels, and these are present in 3 of these 5 panels. So there's a huge overlap. And again, we kept having this feeling that we were just doing the same thing over and over again, but doing the same work as building a new panel from scratch. So we really started thinking about that. And again, with this idea that Mark Edinger from Cytec had introduced, the concept of adding drop-ins, we thought of, why don't we do something more systematic, like on purpose, where so imagine you have a backbone panel that can represent all of the major immune subsets. And then if you want to add a few markers, you don't need to know anything about panel design, because we validated this backbone panel in the sense that any drop-ins that you add, the backbone panel won't influence the drop-ins, and vice versa. None of the drop-ins will influence the quality of the of the resolution of the backbone panel. So let's say if you want to study T cell activation, you can just choose some markers specific for T cell activation. In our case, I'll explain this in more detail, but we can go up to 7 drop-ins at least without having to know anything about panel design. But what if you want to study T cell exhaustion or memory B cells or myeloid subsets? The interesting thing here is that not only you have a backbone panel that allows you to add and expand that panel, but it allows you to do that without having to revalidate your panel or even understand much about panel design. Of course, the more knowledge you have, the better. But the idea was for us to also be, easily provide this type of panels to our researchers without us also having to remake these panels all the time. Another interesting aspect here is that this streamlines also data analysis, as I was mentioning before, because we're essentially using the same colors, right? So we've reserved spaces for the drop-ins. Those are the same colors. The backbone panel is the same by definition for all of the panels. And so in terms of data analysis, it really allows you to provide the same gating strategy and just run this analysis over and over again. Another way to see this is, for instance, if you want to do immune surveillance of several tissues, you're using the same panel, except you can change the specific markers for the respective tissues and be able to do some immune surveillance, again, using the same conceptual panel. So streamlining data analysis, as you'll see, some of the data that we generated, it's very easy to look at several tissues and really quantify the proportions of populations and even expression levels if you want, obviously. So this was the task that we set out to do, and this was published last year. Again, amazing work by Anna, who developed this backbone panel, and together with the help of Mage from Ross Levine's lab at MSK, that they really, she prepared the samples and brought the samples we acquired and analyzed the data. So it was a really nice collaborative work to be able to develop and validate this backbone panel. So what was the purpose? So the purpose is to essentially have a mouse panel that would enable us to do immune surveillance, capturing the major immune subsets in tumor samples and other disease models. So we wanted to make sure that we could characterize those major immune populations, I'll mention in a moment. We wanted to make sure that this was a panel that we could expand and customize. So any researcher that comes with their particular question, we can address that question at least with 7 additional markers. And I say at least, if you have more expertise, you can actually go up to, to more 10 drop-ins or even more if you want, because there's still a lot of available fluorescent space, so to speak. So we wanted that to be expandable and customizable with predefined drop-in fluors so that you didn't have to worry about knowing panel design and being able to change and modify panels. We wanted to make sure also that it worked for a variety of tissues, actually for every tissue. So we wanted to have a universal panel that would work with all the tissues and obviously with all of the spectral cytometers. And why spectral flow cytometry? I mean, again, not only it's easier to develop panels with spectral flow cytometry, but also spectral flow cytometers are very standardized, as I'll show in a moment, data from several flow cytometers, spectral flow cytometers, where you develop a panel, as long as you have 5 lasers and you have a good spectral instrument, your panel actually should work without much work. Of course, it depends on the complexity of that panel. There are nuances between each spectral instrument in terms of optics. But for a panel like this, we thought it would be possible, and I'll show you that is the case. So the immune populations that we set out to characterize, so these were the main immune subsets that the backbone panel can identify. So from lymphoid and myeloid subsets, B cells, CD8, CD4, Tregs, NKs, PDCs, CDCs, neutrophils, macrophages, and LY6 low and high expressing monocytes. So we capture all that with the backbone panel, and it allows us to quantify all these subpopulations or subsets in any tissue that we've ran the panel. Also, Anna did a wonderful job here, developing a gating strategy that also can be used on a systematic way, on a standardized way. So that also enables us to, to compare data, even from our own users. We can, that are running these panels in different tissues. It allows us to standardize this and, hopefully be much more reproducible in the research that they're doing. These are the markers that were chosen to identify the different subpopulations. As you can see, we have, 7 lymphoid markers, 6 myeloid markers, and a CD45 and live dead common markers to all the populations. So the idea and the logic behind the drop-ins was that, so you can imagine the first thing you want to do is you want to identify the drop-ins that you want to use for people to expand and customize their panel. And then what we did is develop the backbone panel with the remaining space, right? It makes it a bit more difficult than developing a panel with all of the space available. But again, the idea was really to make sure that we had enough spaces for enough drop-ins so that people could really customize their panels. So what was the logic? So we wanted to make sure that the fluors that we chose as drop-ins were not only as bright as possible, because you never know, the marker may be low expressed. It could be high expressed, but it could be low expressed, or it could be unknown. So we wanted to make sure they were bright, and also that they were commonly available commercially, right? Because if we choose, some random fluorochrome as a drop-in, it might be very unlikely that any marker will be available with that fluor. So we wanted to make sure that those fluor spaces were commonly available commercially. Also, we wanted to make sure that there was minimal impact of the backbone resolution on the drop-in spaces, and vice versa, that any drop-in that you add won't impact the backbone panel. And then, of course, we want to make sure that the drop-ins would have minimal impact between each other. So if we chose 2 drop-ins that were very close to each other, that might not work depending on the markers that you select. So the first choices were very obvious. BV421 space, FITC, or BB515 space, the PE and the ATC. So the main fluor spaces for every channel with a short and natural Stokes shift. And typically these are bright. And typically if any marker or any antibody is developed out there, it's more likely to be available in one of these fluorochromes, right? And again, it's not that it has to be BV421 or FITC. As long as it's a fluor that's excited and emits in that fluorochrome space, should work without a problem. Another very good point is that the first choice drop-ins shouldn't be really tandem dyes, right? Because this also enables us to have much more flexibility, less issues when unmixing. So there's no degradation if you have a tandem dye, or if you have a tandem that you risk having some degradation due to light exposure or temperature variations that will affect the tandem dye optical properties. And also the fact that we can use these drop-in fluorochrome spaces and add them to the library, right? If they're not tandems, you can be very comfortable to add all of these to the library, and you don't have to worry as much to bring the right single thing control. So there were advantages to choose these kind of drop-ins. But then there were also some other drop-ins that, as we built the backbone panel, that we saw that were very obvious that we could use. So bright fluorochromes like PSI7, BV786, that would also enable us to use as drop-ins. And again, as long as we could validate that they wouldn't influence the backbone panel and vice versa, we should be good to go. And that's what Anna did. So she came up with this panel. As you can see, we have here each laser, the fluorochromes that are excited by each laser, and also their emission space. And you can see we have here 7 drop-ins. So the first obvious ones were the 4 main fluors from each laser. We left BUV395 out because typically it's also not a very bright and maybe not as common marker yet to have in most of the antibodies out there. But you can see there's still a lot of space left. So there's still, if you really want to expand the panel, there's still room for that. But then you do have to have some knowledge in terms of expertise in panel design. But without any expertise in panel design, you can add drop-ins in these fluor spaces without having to worry about that. So we ended up with 15 parameters, so 14 surface markers plus a live dead and 7 custom markers that we call drop-ins, ending up with a 22 parameter panel, which is something that's very, relatively, I wouldn't say easy, but it's relatively okay to manage, so to speak. Another really nice idea that Anna put together is that she intercalated the lymphoid and the myeloid markers, not only in this direction, but also trying in this direction not to have too much of an overlap between myeloid and lymphoid, or have lymphoid together, so that, since these are mutually exclusive markers, we would have also better quality or better chances of having good quality panel. So we end up putting that together, and then there were several steps to validate this, to make sure that all of the criteria was met. Again, we wanted to make sure the backbone panel clearly resolves the major immune subsets, that the backbone panel must have minimal impact on the resolution of the drop-in fluorochromes, and vice versa, that the drop-in fluorochromes have minimal impact on the backbone resolution. So, we used some common techniques to be able to validate. So, for instance, comparing single stain controls with the fully stained backbone panel to check to see if there's loss of resolution, so increase of spread of the negatives. In some cases, we do see some loss of resolution, like here, LY6GBV711, or with a CD8VUV, but these are so highly expressed markers that we weren't very concerned with that, and it seemed that the panel was working pretty well. Again, some loss of resolution, for instance, for the live dead and IR, so we weren't too worried about that because we could still capture the difference between live and dead cells and things like that. And here's a very nice way to show that we were able to capture all of the major immune subsets that we set out to identify. So this is a manual gating analysis, but also looking at the unsupervised analysis, we were able to capture all of those subpopulations using a simple t-SNE map. So showing that even with unsupervised analysis, we were able to capture these subsets, immune subsets. Now, there were some troubleshooting steps that we had to go through. For instance, CD3 is not, at least the surface staining for CD3 is not very high in mouse or in mice. Based on techniques like Oliver Burton's overnight staining, we started thinking of solutions to improve the resolution. For instance, here, what Anna did was instead of adding everything for a 30-minute incubation, she added CD3 first in a 30-minute incubation, and then added the rest of the antibodies with another 30 minutes, and we improved the resolution of CD3. I'll talk about this later, but CD3 may not be the best marker, at least for surface staining, to use to identify T cells. But at least with some troubleshooting steps here, we were able to improve the resolution of CD3. But so just for you to know that not everything was amazing, in this panel, but it's just part of it, and you need to understand how to troubleshoot and improve, which is what we're doing still to this day. The other thing was to check the impact of the backbone panel on the drop-in fluorochrome. So here you're seeing cells gated on the lymphoid subsets and here on the myeloid subsets. What we're doing here is comparing the fully stained backbone and comparing it to the unstained. And here you're seeing the drop-in spaces. And you can see that when it's the backbone stained cells, there's some spread in some of the negatives. So we were trying to see how much spread do we have and how much resolution are we losing. And you can see that it pretty much looks really well. Maybe here in the myeloid subsets, with PSI7 and BV786, we do lose some resolution. But what we saw is that with the panel that we had, even that slight loss of resolution wasn't enough to compromise the quality of the populations that we're identifying. Then we started to add the drop-ins and see how much they would impact the backbone panel. And so here you're seeing the same backbone panel, same sample, except one was just stained with the backbone panel markers, and then the other one with the backbone plus the drop-ins. And you can see that pretty much everything, the resolution of all the populations that we were identifying are pretty much the same. And you can see also here the frequency of live CD45, the subpopulations within the CD45 subset, the percentages are pretty much the same without any changes. So no impact of the drop-ins on the backbone panel. Now, obviously, it's maybe it's just those drop-ins that are not impacting, maybe other drop-ins. So we did test several variations of the backbone panel with different types of drop-ins, but also we wanted to make sure that it worked with more complex tissues. Again, we want to do this in the context of a cancer center, of cancer research. And so we wanted to make sure that in that context, we could still capture the right populations and there was no loss of resolution due to the complexity of the tissues. And again, here, looking at dissociated lungs in mice, we were able with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 drop-ins. We could see that also there's really no significant impact of the backbone panel resolution when you add those drop-ins. Another important aspect, as I mentioned, is that we wanted to make sure that this was validated for every spectral instrument that we had. And initially, when we published, we had access in our core to 3 spectral instruments, the Aurora, the Sony ID7000, and the FACS Symphony S6. And as you can see, we can still, regardless of the spectral instrument, we can still capture the populations that we needed to capture, and you can see that summarized here. And again, as a percentage of CD45 cells, all of the subpopulations, you can see that the percentages are pretty much the same with manual gating, are pretty much the same regardless of the spectral instrument that we used. More recently, we've had the privilege to be able to test new spectral instruments. Recently, we had access to a Novocyte Option, the spectral instrument from Haviland. And again, as you can see, we can capture all of the populations nicely. Also, with the FACS Discover S8 that we now have in the core, this is a spectral and imaging system sorter from BD, where again, we were able to capture the same populations. Here, it's important not to really look at differences in resolution. There will be some instruments that have a bit better resolution in some parameters, but a bit less resolution in another. Here, the important thing that we were trying to really understand is whether, regardless of the spectral instrument, we were able to capture those populations. And again, even with new instruments that we've never seen, we're being able to run this panel that wasn't built for these instruments, but we can run it without any issues. Now, even more recently, we have had the pleasure and the honor to receive a FACS Discover A8. So this is the first instrument in the world that was installed in our facility, and we've been trying it out and evaluating it. So it's not even commercially available yet. So this is the analyzer version of the FACS Discover S8. So it's a spectral analyzer, fully spectral with imaging capabilities. And in fact, we can run it in different modes, imaging mode, which is a low speed mode, and then the non-imaging mode, which is a high speed mode. So we wanted to make sure that we could also use this spectral backbone panel in this type of instrument. And again, as you can see, we were able to capture very nicely all of the populations that we set out to capture without having to modify anything. So we didn't even run the sequential staining with CD3 in all of these instruments. and we could still capture, relatively good resolution in CD3. So, this shows that again, even instruments that are being developed after we developed our backbone panel are still more than capable of resolving these populations. So we were pretty happy to see that this is working universally, regardless of the spectral instruments that you have available. And if you want to know more about the 8, I would be happy to talk more about that after the lecture. So we also made sure that in terms of percentages, we were capturing the same percentages, and you can see they're fairly similar with manual gating, without being concerned about any modifications to the panel. Again, we were able to capture similar percentages in all of these instruments without any modifications. I also mentioned that it was very important that we could use this backbone panel in any organ, any tissue. And this was a nice work that Anna did. Here you see a UMAP of in different tissues, again, using the same panel, same backbone panel, and you can summarize very nicely the different percentages throughout the different tissues. And as I said, very easy to streamline this analysis because we're using the same panel, same colors in all of these different tissues. Even if you want to customize it and expand it, you're still using the same colors that are available. Those 22, let's say, parameters are always the same. We again made sure that this panel worked in complex tumor samples. Here's a pancreatic adenocarcinoma tissue where we added 6 drop-ins, and we were able to capture very nicely. And then you can do very simple things like comparing normal versus tumor tissue and looking at the differences, whether it's percentages, levels of expression, whatever you want. But again, very easily to do this analysis and capture this information very quickly without needing to know anything about panel design, which I think is pretty cool. The other thing, and this was the reason why we started by developing a surface marker panel, was because some of our researchers that were collaborating with us actually wanted to use highly expressing fluorescent proteins. Here's the case with TD tomato. So you see these, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 drop-ins, including TD tomato, those highly expressed. And as you can see, still we are capturing all of the populations that we needed from the backbone panel, plus the added drop-in markers, so without any impact on its resolution. So again, we're validating that we can use this panel with highly expressing fluorescent proteins. Obviously, you will have to validate for each fluorescent protein because they have very broad emission spectrum. But we've actually have an example here with BFP. We've looked at M-cherry, and we can still capture, like I said, the resolutions that we need. Now, this was just so we've published all that data, but it's nice to see that we have even independent users in our institution that have read the paper and are using the backbone panel by themselves, and they allowed us to share the data here. Again, they're able to capture all of the populations that they wanted with 7 drop-ins, including BFP there. So we have BFP, and again, without having to choose or to modify the panel, needing to know how to build a panel, the rules of panel design, etc. Just straight out of the box, they can apply this panel and with very good result. Here's another example in a neighboring institution, Columbia University in New York. Mike Kistner, who runs one of the cores there, is a fervent proponent of this backbone panel and has been distributing to all his users. And again, this was a really great example of another successful panel where this researcher in this case had no experience with panel design. He was given this panel, ran it, and with very good quality data and good resolution. So we were very happy to see these these examples coming to fruition. In terms of future developments, as I mentioned, we do have some things that we want to improve. One of them is CD3 resolution. So we've tried swapping the fluor, didn't really work. We actually tried to swap the clone, didn't really work. And Anna's been talking about this for a while, that we might just replace CD3 with TCR alpha beta. If you're looking to, at gamma delta T cells, you can add that as a drop-in, use one of the drop-in spaces to be able to look at that also simultaneously. But this would really improve the resolution of CD3 T cells, which is important, obviously, downstream of all the gating strategy that we have. So we want to make sure that all of these pan markers are nicely resolved so that it's more reproducible. We are also developing, as we speak, a backbone panel for intracellular staining. As I mentioned, we started with a surface marker panel, but we want to make sure that people can do any type of immune surveillance, including looking at cytokines and other intracellular markers like FOXP3. So we've actually started already developing that. This is work done by Clara and Gabrielle together with the help of Magda, and where they've been able to already, they started modifying using these drop-ins. You can see FOXP3 as a drop-in, although the idea is to include it in a version, an intracellular version of the backbone panel. But they just added these intracellular markers as drop-ins, and again, we can see that we still captured all of the populations that we needed, including FOXP3 regulatory T cells. So we were pretty happy with this. This is still preliminary data. We're still making improvements on the panel to make sure that it's robust, and we do all those validations that I just mentioned that we did for the surface staining backbone panel. But we're not going to stop there. We're also thinking of developing a human backbone panel. Actually, there have been other cores and in other institutions that are interested in this and that would like to collaborate with us. So we're more than open to any collaboration, but we'll definitely be developing a human version, both intracellular and surface staining, to make sure that we can also immune surveil the human tissues that we capture all the time. So basically, in summary, as I mentioned, I think we've been able to develop a different concept, not an original idea per se, but no one had really tried this before, to systematically to build a panel that you could expand and customize without having to understand or modify anything in the panel and still capture the resolution that we wanted, and that would be could be used in any type of tissue, normal, complex tissues, from disease models or from tumor samples that we typically study. It was also important to make sure that it resolved and it maintained its resolution in different spectral flow cytometers. I think we've shown that. We've already ran it in 6 different spectral instruments with very different optical configurations and technologies, and it still worked in all of them. Like I said, there are always going to be some slight changes. If you're developing for a particular instrument, you probably will develop a slightly better panel, but it's really great to see that with spectral flow cytometry, we can just build a panel and apply it to all of these instruments, different technologies, without having to modify anything. So the panel has been validated to incorporate up to 7 fluorochromes, so 7 drop-ins, and that includes several different fluorescent proteins. So we think we've been able to really build a robust backbone panel. Like I said, it can be expanded, customizable, and we think that, again, it saves time and resources, not only for us that are helping others to develop the panel, but also for those that want to develop their own solutions, and they have here something that they can use without having to validate and go through all that work, which can take a long time. And also with the fact that we're using the same panel, regardless of the markers that you're adding, same panel in terms of fluors, it means that we can also bring consistency and standardization not only to the acquisition, but also to the analysis of these panels. So making it a very valuable solution for our immunologists and oncology researchers. And finally, I'd just like to thank many people that were involved. I mean, obviously, our team, and I want to highlight Gabrielle, Clara, who have been really instrumental in continuing the work that Anna was doing. Especially Gabrielle, that's been doing most of the analysis that you saw there. He's the one that's been working on this. I want to thank obviously Inês and Margaret from Ross and Scott Lowe's lab at MSKCC. They collaborated with us, staining, putting together all of these panels to be able to test them. And so their work was instrumental. Mike Kistner is our almost our marketing person at Columbia University, marketing our panel to a lot of users who have given us a lot of good insights on improving the panel. And obviously, that we've had a lot of support over the years from different companies who have given a lot of suggestions, a lot of help into putting together this final package. And obviously, the last person I want to thank is Anna Longini for all of the work that she put together. I think this was an incredible work, and it was also an incredible collaborative work. We saw a lot of, as you see, a lot of these people coming together and really just wanting to help us provide a really good solution for our researchers. So really happy with that. Thank you very much. So, shall we do the questions after? Take a coffee break? Let me stop till 10:45.
All right, everyone, we are on a coffee break where we're going to read then till 10:45. We're going to reconvene for the kind of final talk in this set, and then we'll have a roundtable to answer questions, Q&A period. So why don't you grab some coffee and maybe talk to a vendor or two. CD5.
CD5?
Your T-cell problem. CD3, because you already have CD4, CD19 in it. So you can. So the only other thing CD5 is really on. That's what we did in the international MUS phenotype.
Okay.
We switched over from CD3, same problems. Rice downregulate the CD3 as well.
Right. But don't you think it, like the intracellular version, we stain CD3 intracellular?
No, that would
get,
yeah.
okay. Right.
That would,
No, it's okay.
although I've never done it.
Right.
I've never seen how well.
Because that's
What do you mean, when are you on the
So
table?
down-
We should. No, the bell was nice 2 years ago. I think we should get it back. I think the bell was the perfect, like, get your shit together.
The problem is all these vendors trying to talk to people. Like, oh, this is our time to shine.
Those damn vendors.
Come on, these dang vendors.
I'm not the vendor over there. Yes.
You should make like joke ones to bring to conferences yourself, like sleepiest boy, or I don't know, like just things like that. See if anyone knows.
Waiting for Meredith to come back. But I don't want to. We send her that way and we start the battle. All right, we're gonna start. So it's my pleasure to introduce you Peter Mage. I hope everybody knows him, but if you don't, Peter Mage is a principal engineer at the BD. He's also Isaac innovator. What he does at BD is responsible for inventing and commercializing new tools for understanding biology at the single cells level. Peter works focused on computational techniques in the spectral cytometry. Prior joining BD in 2018, he developed biosensor technology for personalized medicine as a postdoc at Stanford University. Peter earned a PhD in material from University of California, Santa Barbara, and old bachelor degree in physics and math. Welcome here.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thanks everyone. I'm really excited to be here today to round out our panel design session on the first morning of FlowTex. So I was here last year actually for the first time. This is an awesome conference. It's probably my favorite Flow conference. Don't tell anyone at ISAC. But I'm really excited to talk to you about some new things that we've been doing to help with pushing panel design and pushing spectral panels to that next level. How do we make bigger panels that are better, that perform better? And I'm really lucky to get to follow David and Rui because they presented really well some of these fundamental concepts that go into multicolor flow, whether it's conventional or spectral. Rui gave great examples of if you do this well, you can make a panel that just works on any instrument, that works regardless of the markers and floors that people are adding in. And I think that's a really great example of why this is important. The title for today is really bad, actually, and I realized that after I did it. So hopefully it'll make sense at the end. Spectral hotspot analysis predicts unmixing-dependent spreading. But really, the real title here is why making a big panel is hard and how math can help, maybe. So let's dive right in. Whether you are a frightened engineer in a room full of biologists like myself, or a frightened biologist in a room full of cytometers like some of you might be during the regular week, I think that there's really powerful truth in what is called Shapiro's zeroth law. So Howard Shapiro wrote Practical Flow Cytometry. Many people here either know him or have seen this, knew him or have seen this book on their core manager's bookshelf. But before introducing his laws of cytometry, the zeroth law is that there is no magic, meaning that anything that happens in your cytometer, in your experiment, there's a physical explanation for it. You may never learn what that is, but there is a reason for why what is happening to your data is happening. And so our objective today is to kind of focus on some specific things that seem magical and weird when we're trying to make really big spectral panels. And we're going to try to dispel that magic by explaining what's going on and giving some practical approaches to deal with it. And so to do that today, what we're going to do is kind of split the talk into 3 parts. The first is introducing why is making a big panel hard, and why is making a spectral panel hard in general, if you haven't already appreciated that from the previous 2 talks. The second section is really condensed version of last year's presentation that I gave here. So if you see anything and you're like, what the heck is that? That talk is recorded. You can actually watch it on YouTube from last year, and I encourage you to do that if you're interested. And then I'll spend most of the talk on part 3, which is talking about something called unmixing-dependent spreading and introducing a new tool we developed called the hotspot matrix that can help with addressing that. So let's dive right in. Why is making a big panel hard? Well, if we think about kind of the history of flow, and David actually did a great job of introducing this concept, right? If I wanted to make a bigger and bigger panel because I want to measure more biology, more markers, right? It used to be that you could just sort of add a detector that measures a new dye, or maybe you add a laser that measures a new class of dyes. You can go scuba diving off of the California coast and find something like APC or PE. You can develop polymer dyes that are excited by the violet laser, et cetera. And this process for like 50 years basically led to what we've called high parameter flow, right? And this is showing an example on a conventional 5 laser system of what those fluorochromes look like. But we know that you can't just pick any of these, right? As David and Rui pointed out to you, you need to think about how these colors interact with each other. And the reason is that your panel design determines the final quality of your biological data, right? In a sense, what panel design is doing is telling us how we're going to map invisible molecular information on our cells that we can't see to light that we can measure, that's machine interpretable, and that we can ultimately derive something from. So if I look at 2 different panels, looking at T-cell markers, on the top, I would probably say that the resolution I'm achieving in this top panel is better than the resolution in this bottom panel. It turns out that these are looking at the exact same sample, the exact same set of markers on the same instrument on the same day. The only difference is that choice of fluorochromes for my panel. And I can see that that choice of fluorochromes can either preserve information or lose information about my underlying biology. And we know that as we make panels bigger, it gets harder to preserve that data quality, right? Because as I add markers, I need to use more fluorochromes, and inevitably those fluorochromes start to overlap with each other and lead to things like spillover spreading. So this problem is twofold, right? I have to start using more highly overlapping dye combinations as the panel gets bigger because there just aren't other options. And I have to start dealing with more co-expression of markers because there are more things that could be on a single cell that I'm looking at in my panel. So there have been a lot of panel design tools and approaches that can help you kind of ensure that you're getting good quality data in your panel, right? So there are kind of these old school things, thinking about picking the right fluorochromes for your markers based on antigen density and brightness, and there are all kinds of tools available for doing that. And when you start getting beyond those kind of easy to resolve sets of fluorochromes spread out across lasers, very little overlap, you have to start thinking about these kind of pairwise interactions like spillover spreading that occur, and you start using these matrices that may or may not make a whole lot of sense. So now let's look at the spectral paradigm that we're in, right? We're all talking about spectral panel design today. In the last 5-10 years, we've really changed the game. It's not just scuba diving and finding a new fluorescent protein and adding it. Basically, instruments are no longer limited in the number of detectors that we can use to measure fluorochromes. And new technologies for fluorochrome chemistries have enabled us to make hundreds of different fluorochromes. So that number that David quoted Kelly is saying, about 220, that's about our estimate as well for the number of potentially distinct fluorochrome molecules that are available for flow right now. It's not really just about adding these colors anymore, right? It's about picking the right sets of colors to use for your biological experiment. So this introduces new types of tools, right? For making those larger panels, we have to start thinking about these spectral specific metrics, things like similarity scores, things like complexity or the condition number of your spectral matrix, which we'll get into. But if we look at kind of the history of adding fluorochromes, adding detectors, and the maximum possible panel size, we see that there's kind of a lag happening. So what I worked on a little bit last year was just compiling when were all of these fluorochromes released, when were instruments with different numbers of detectors available, and what was sort of the largest published panel in a given year. And so if we go up to about 2018, which was the year I joined BD, you can see there's kind of this trend, right? That everything is expanding and panel size sort of lags because you can't just throw all of these fluorochromes together. If you look at the last 6 or 7 years, there was this really significant increase in the number of fluorochromes available and the number of max detectors available on a spectral instrument. Panel size has not really kept up with that, right? So if I look, there's all of these new dye technologies that are coming out. The move to spectral has really increased the number of detectors we have available. And if we look at the largest panels that have been published, OMIP 69 showing 40 color flow came out a few years ago. We published OMIP 102 showing 50 color flow last year. But there's still this big gap, right? Why isn't there a 100 color panel yet when we have more than enough detectors and more than enough fluorochromes? Well, the challenge is that if you try to start adding these fluorochromes together, you start seeing some weird stuff that's beyond those rules of co-expression and brightness and antigen density that we just talked about. So as an example, this was an early attempt at OMIP 102 where we were trying to make, in this case, a 51 color panel. And Andrew, one of the co-authors at the Fred Hutch, was trying to go from a 20 color backbone to a 51 color backbone here, or a 51 color panel. And so you can see there's kind of this catastrophic loss of resolution. There is a huge amount of spread, but that could be coming from spillover spreading from all those new fluorochromes. Who knows what's going on? But if we try and just unmix that raw 20 color data with the 51 color matrix, I still see this huge increase in spread happening just from using a different matrix that contains additional fluorochromes. So this tells me that there's something going on beyond these kind of existing rules for panel design that I'm going to have to start thinking about. And for us, this was an uh-oh moment because we had no idea what was going on. So let's back up a little bit. Maybe it's just a problem of picking the wrong pairs of fluorochromes, right? So if I showed you these 3 CD4 overlays of different fluorochrome pair combinations, most of us would probably prefer to use the one on the left. One in the middle you could get away with, and the one on the right is clearly pushing the bounds of what bi-exponential scaling can even handle. Of course, these are all the same data. They're the same 2 fluorochromes that should be trivial to work with, right? But what we're seeing is just by unmixing with different matrices that are starting to get really big, we start to see this progressive loss of resolution. And if I do this across a range of different panel sizes with increasing complexities, I get the situation where a perfectly usable pair of fluorochromes is somehow getting messed up by other stuff going on in the matrix. So how do we solve this problem? No idea, right? We don't have the tools available yet, meaning us in this room so far, to answer this question. So what we're going to do is pause and actually step back and try to develop an understanding of spectral flow that will give us access to mathematical tools that we can then use to maybe address and overcome this problem. So that's what part 2 is going to be here. How can we build our intuition for what spectral flow is so that we can access mathematical tools that might be helpful? And this is a condensed version of last year's talk, like I said, so you can tune out if you were here last year or pay attention if you weren't. Okay, so to do this, right, let's remember what we're doing with a flow cytometer. We are trying to measure invisible proteins. We are doing that by encoding proteins with fluorescently labeled antibodies so that I encode each protein of interest or each molecule of interest with a color. And then I measure the amount of that color, and that tells me something about the amount of protein on each of my cells, right? So what spectral flow does is kind of change how we go through that transformation process. And so if I break this out, what I'm doing is measuring the light that is emitted from each of these fluorochromes off of the cell. And they're each going to emit a certain amount of their colored light in proportion to how much of that molecule is there. What the cytometer sees is kind of the total light. I don't know which molecule a given photon came from, so I just get a total spectrum. We're then going to sample that with some set of detectors, digitize that signal, and then the key thing is I'm going to go through a kind of inference process. I'm going to say, given that I measured this purple curve, and given that I know the molecules there had the blue, the green, and the orange spectrum, how much of each of those individual colors would explain the signal I measured? And that is actually what I'm going to be looking at on my dot plot, in my UMAP or TISNE, et cetera. So just to make sure our ground rules are set here, right? What full spectrum flow or spectral flow is doing relative to conventional flow is just 2 essentially different things. First, we use more detectors than fluorochromes in our instrument. And second, we use math called spectral unmixing instead of math called compensation to do this inference process. David was completely correct earlier. They're really the same thing, just a little bit different, and I'll explain that in a minute. Okay, that was boring. Let's do a little bit of finger painting here to make it a little bit more interesting. So we know that a fun thing that humans can do, and probably other animals as well, is take primary colors and mix them and make new colors, right? So if I mix blue and yellow paint, I get green. If I change their relative amounts, I can get new colors. So more blue and less yellow gives me something like cyan. But the really important thing is that if I know what colors were used and I see a new color, I can kind of infer what colors were probably used. So if I see green, I can tell that this probably had an equal amount of blue and yellow. If I see cyan, I can infer that that probably was using more blue and less yellow. Hopefully the analogy is becoming a little bit clear here. Just like in painting, we can create new colors by mixing primary colors in different amounts. And then because we know those primary colors, we can infer what was used when we see a new color. Just like that, in spectral flow, we can sort of paint our cells with individual primary colors. Those are our fluorochromes. And then create new colors based on the relative amount of each of those single colors on our cells. So we could have like a cyan spectra on a cell that has more FITC and less PE versus a green spectrum on a cell that has equal amounts. And then I'm going to do some inference based on that measured new color and based on the single colors that I know were there to figure out how much of each color was present. Okay, so that's how our eyes interpret color, but we can think of this in a more quantitative sense. So our eyes are built of rods and cones. Our cones are sensitive to different parts of the spectrum in different amounts. This is kind of an oversimplification, but those different spectrally sensitive detectors combined with our visual cortex will see a color and interpret it as a new color, right? Cyan or green. Cytometer is really doing the same thing, except it has photodetectors that are electronic. And instead of interpreting a new spectrum as a color, it interprets it as a series of numbers. I think numbers are boring. Computers are crazy about these things. So we're going to say that a cytometer sees color as a series of numbers instead of as a color. Okay, so now what we're going to do is put a little more rigor around this kind of conceptual understanding of mixing colors with something called the linear mixture model. And this is the math that is used to describe how multicolor flow works, how compensation works, and how spectral and mixing works. So let's take our little cartoon of 3 colors on a cell combining to form a new color. What I can do is break out each of those colors and define its single color spectrum, right? So if blue here goes into each of these detectors in slightly different amounts, I can digitize that and say maybe 5 parts go into the first detector, 1 into the second, and 0 into the third. If I have 2 of those molecules, then my total contribution is just going to be 2 times that single color spectrum. I can do that for each of my additional colors. And then the total signal that I measure is just going to be the sum of those 3 different contributions. But of course, the cytometer doesn't know where a photon came from, so it just sees them all as a mixture. Okay, now we're going to rotate. Oops, sorry, missed my animation. All right, so now we're going to rotate and start reducing this, right? So this is just a different way of representing that same information, but we're starting to make it a little bit more mathematical. I'm defining each of these colors as a vector, so a list of numbers, and I'm just saying the vector describing one color times the number of that color's molecules is going to give me its total contribution. I can start condensing this using rules from something called linear algebra. So now I'm representing this as a matrix times a vector of my fluorophore abundances. That gives me my total measured signal. And as I like to say, mathematicians hate joy and beauty. So we're going to take all the colorful, fun things out and just make this into a matrix representation. Even this is too whimsical, and we're going to replace it with variable names. So this gives us sort of the expression of the linear mixture model in terms of these matrices and vectors. I'm going to call this matrix of single color spectra R for my reference spectral matrix. A is my vector of fluorophore abundances, and M is my vector of mixed signals, the things I'm measuring on my detector. Okay, so what is spectral intermixing or compensation? Well, what I just described to you is where signal comes from, but we actually have a different problem, right? We get the signal off of our instrument. We want to know what was its source? What was the underlying amount of each fluorochrome that explains what I just measured? In other words, I know what the single color spectra are because I brought single color controls to the core and ran them today, right? And I know what I measured on the cytometer because I just measured it on the cytometer. But what I want to know is the underlying amount of blue, green, and orange fluorochromes that explain what I just measured. So the mathematical representation we just talked through is sort of the forward problem. What we care about doing is solving the inverse problem that explains where the signal came from. And this is literally compensation. So what I showed you here would be the spillover matrix. This new matrix that we use to solve the inverse problem is the compensation matrix. So all of conventional flow since like 1977, when Dave Parks and some others published on compensation for 2 and 3 color flow, it's just doing this math in some form. If you talk to someone like Bartek Rajwa, he'll point out this used to happen in analog electronics with log amplifiers and stuff. And if that's the kind of thing you're into, which I am, it's very interesting. So let's go and do spectral unmixing now. It's the same thing, essentially. So all I've done to make this spectral is add an additional detector so that I have more detectors than colors. But you can see that all of the math still looks kind of the same. My forward problem is described in this way. And then if I do ordinary least squares, which is kind of the most simple way of doing spectral unmixing, I'm basically solving the same type of math problem, just my matrices have different shapes. And here, instead of a compensation matrix, I have something called a pseudo-inverse matrix. But overall, I'm doing kind of the same effective process here. Now, there are some complexities that come in when we talk about different unmixing algorithms, which we're not going to do today. But essentially, we're doing the same thing, right? So why did I drag all of you through this very quickly? Well, because it's fun, and because expressing the problem in terms of math gives us access to additional ways of thinking about our problem that may be useful. Mathematicians are incredibly lazy. So instead of solving a new problem, what they usually try to do is frame their problem in terms of a problem that someone else has already solved, and then they can just use that solution. But what that gives us is a way of thinking about problems from different perspectives. So there's actually a geometric way to think about everything I just talked about. Instead of going from a mixture to an unmixed and back, I can think about unmixing or compensation as mapping my signal between different spaces, right? Different geometries. So in the case of compensation, what I'm actually doing is mapping from in the case of a 2-color, 2-detector system, I'm mapping from a 2-dimensional space, because I have 2 detectors, to a 2-dimensional space that contains 2 colors. But what's really important is that when I compensate, I sort of decorrelate my data, right? So here I'm showing real data from 2 different CD4 stains for colors that overlap a little bit in both of these detectors. It's not like CD4 on this cell is actually co-expressed with CD4 on this cell, right? It's just an artifact of those spectra overlapping. When I then compensate, I just take those 2 populations and kind of stretch them out until they stop correlating. Unmixing is really doing the same thing, except we're going from a higher dimensional space to a lower dimensional space. So this is the same data, but I've added data from a 3rd detector here. I can see that my 2 populations look like they're kind of co-expressed or correlated, but that's just an artifact of the spectra. And when I unmix, I'm going from that 3-dimensional space where data is correlated to a 2-dimensional space where my data is orthogonal and now only shows correlation if there's true biological correlation. So if I abstract this a little bit, what I can think of is that my spectral matrix, right, that describes how signals map to detectors, that's taking me from this lower dimensional molecular space that contains my marker expression, and it's mapping it into this higher dimensional detector space. That's where I'm actually measuring things. Then when we unmix, we're using this pseudo-inverse matrix to map back into the unmixed space that sort of represents that invisible molecular information. That's what I care about for deriving a biological conclusion. So if I kind of try to tie this all together with the different ways of thinking about this, right? When we're moving forward, when we're generating those detector signals, I'm mixing my single colors and getting some new higher dimensional signal. I can represent that as mapping from a low dimensional to a high dimensional space, and there's math that describes that. When we do unmixing or compensation, we're just going backwards, right? We're going from this raw spectral data to a lower dimensional space that's biologically meaningful. Again, mapping from high dimensional detector space to low dimensional unmixed space, and there's math that describes that as well. The really, really important thing that's going to help us solve unmixing-dependent spreading is the fact that not only does our signal map from that unmixed, or from our molecular space to detector space to back to unmixed space, noise also maps. So if I think about the true abundances of my molecules that I can't directly measure, right? a given cell does have a determined specific amount of CD4 and CD8, et cetera. But when I move into detector space, I start introducing noise, right? There's noise from my electronics, there's spillover spreading, there's variation from my laser and my fluidics. When I then unmix from that raw detector space, I have irrevocably included that noise. I can't get rid of it. There's a LCD Sound System song called Drunk Girls, but there's a line, right? Love is an astronaut. It comes back, but it's never the same. Our signal is kind of like that here, right? When we go into detector space, even when we come back, we have picked up this noise and we can't get rid of it. And it turns out that that mapping process for noise can also be analytically described and used to predict certain things, things like unmixing-dependent spreading. So with the remaining kind of 20 minutes or so that I have, we're going to go through unmixing-dependent spreading, kind of the limiting factor for panel size right now. We'll explain how to quantify it, how to define it, and then most importantly, how to predict and avoid it in the panel design process. So let's come back. This unmixing-dependent spreading, whether you've heard of this or not, is something that happens essentially to everyone who's trying to make a big panel. And it is sort of why you stop trying to make a big panel at some point. So this happened to us when we were trying to develop the 50 color panel early on. It actually shows up in other published panels. So if we look at examples of spread that were highlighted in OMIP 69, we can in fact see that we start seeing these like weird tilted diagonal populations. If I look at just single stain data and unmix it with a 2-color matrix versus the full 40-color matrix, I start seeing the spread. This is evidence that unmixing-dependent spreading doesn't ruin results, right? It just gives us an additional source of noise we start having to account for. And even in our final version of OMIP 102, we do see this with certain combinations of fluorochromes still impacting our resolution. And again, I'll just remind you, this is something that's not tied to co-expression. It's not tied to having too many fluors in my tube. It happens purely as a result of how we process this data through unmixing with big matrices that contain a lot of fluorochromes. So let's actually put a definition on this term. What we can do is kind of define 3 different hallmarks or ways that unmixing-dependent spreading, or UDS, can manifest itself in measured data. So the first and most obvious is that we see this unexpected negative spreading occurring. If I take the same raw data and unmix it with a smaller panel versus a larger panel, I see this increase in spread of my negatives. It's been sometimes called like bloat or inflation of these negative populations that has nothing to do with spillover spreading. The second is actually that you can see spillover spreading enhanced. So this is a combination of dyes that in a 25-color backbone panel, there's no spillover spreading between them. In the context of a larger matrix, we actually start to see a problematic spillover spreading, which would actually tell me that something like an SSM could depend on the specific panel I'm using, not just on the combinations of fluorochromes, which is troubling. And then finally, these kind of spooky, tilted, double negative populations that look really weird. Mario Roeder actually published a paper about this in 2015, looking at compensation experiments where we're using really highly overlapping dyes and really autofluorescent samples. And I'm told that he named the paper this to win a bet for a case of beer or something. So you can ask him about that. So these are the sort of empirical presentations. If we want to put a definition on it, what UDS means is a change in the variance or the spread of an unmixed parameter when we take the same raw data and unmix it using different spectral matrices. And that could mean that our spectral matrix contains a different set of fluorochromes. It could mean that it contains a different number or quantity of fluorochromes. But this is really what we're talking about when we talk about unmixing-dependent spreading. Okay, when are you going to encounter this? It's not something that's going to come up in every single panel, right? So I want to make that clear at the start. You will run into this if you're making a big spectral panel. And right now, that's like in the 30 to 40 plus space. And that could mean you're trying to expand an existing panel that is already spectrally full, like the cartoon I was showing earlier, or you're trying to make a new panel from scratch, but at some point you kind of run out of these easy pairs of fluorochromes to use. You start having to use pairs that have really high similarity, et cetera. The other case where this can happen is if you were doing something weird on accident, like making a bad panel, which is, it's not weird because it's very common to do, but you might be unnecessarily using like really similar fluorochromes when there are better options available. The other case is if you're doing something weird, but on purpose, and there are reasons to do that, right? If you're using really highly similar fluorochromes or combinations of dyes, you may start running into this, and you may have no choice but to use those for your experiment. Okay, so that's when it happens. How can we measure when UDS is actually occurring? Well, there's kind of a strategy you can take, and I've already shown it a little bit, right? We're looking at our data unmixed in a condition where there is not UDS occurring, and then we look at the unmixing in our full panel that we're interested in. So that's all we do. We take our same raw data. That could be my fully stained panel. It could be a single stain control. And I'm going to unmix it in a reference case where I don't expect UDS to occur, like a single color matrix or a 2-color matrix or a backbone, versus my full panel matrix that contains all of my colors. So here's an example of Alexa 647 and Spark NIR 685, where I've taken the same combination of CD4 data and just unmixed it with those 2 different matrices. Then what I can do is, just like when we calculate SSM or stain index, I can compute statistics based on that data, right? So I can calculate the standard deviations of my positive and negative populations. I can calculate what their separation is, et cetera. And then I can compare those statistics between that reference condition and my full panel condition. And so I can get something like a ratio. How much bigger did my RSD of my negative get in my full panel unmixing versus my single color unmixing? So this is something we actually used in OMIP 102 when trying to find a compatible combination of 50 fluorochromes that could be used together. One way of visualizing this that's actually in the SI of that paper is to take each of our single colors, but run it as a CD4, and we're just going to unmix it 2 different ways. So on the top of each of these plots is the CD4 data unmixed with a matrix that contains just that color plus autofluorescence, because we want to account for that. The bottom is showing that color unmixed with the full 50-color matrix that we're interested in. So you can see that in certain cases, they're pretty comparable. But if I look at certain combinations, I can see that my negative actually gets much wider when I'm unmixing in that full panel context. And in some cases, that negative gets a lot bigger. So what I can do is calculate, say, the RSD of that negative population for each of these combinations and calculate the ratio of the RSD in the 50-color unmixing versus that single color unmixing. And then I can plot that ratio of RSDs here. And this gives me kind of a readout across all of my colors of how much resolution am I losing due to this unmixing-dependent spreading. Okay. I can even go a little further and start to evaluate differences in spillover spreading that occur. So this is looking at the same panel. What I've done is create a spillover spreading matrix, one of which is just looking at each pair in isolation. So a single entry in the matrix on the left is just the spillover spreading for, say, BUV661 and APC, unmixed with a matrix only containing those 2 colors. On the right is that same combination of dyes, but unmixed with the full 50-color matrix. And I can start to highlight certain entries where there's minimal spillover spreading in the 2-color case, but measurable spillover spreading in the 50-color unmixing, even for the same raw data. And I can find different examples where my impact of spillover spreading actually can be quite significant as a result of unmixing in the context of that full panel. So it doesn't just impact our unstained cells, our negatives, it does also impact spillover spreading, which is complicated and annoying, but it is what it is. Okay, so all of that stuff I showed, I generated that in Python. I have all this data. I'm unmixing it different ways. That is kind of difficult to do with most flow software, and it's not something you really want to do while designing a panel, right? You would like to just be able to maybe predict where this is going to happen and avoid it. So this is definitely a spectral problem for the most part. So can these spectral metrics like similarity and complexity, can they help us solve the problem? The answer is kind of, but there are still some gaps. So to illustrate challenges in predicting UDS, what we're going to do is look at an example panel. We're going to start with a pretty okay 38-color panel, and I'm going to make it really bad by trying to add another color to that panel. So how I did this was basically looking at all of the spectra that are in this panel. There's no really obvious spaces to add a commercially available fluorochrome. You'll see some gaps around here, but there aren't really floors that fit in there. So what I'm going to do is pick 2 different possible spectral neighborhoods that are already pretty crowded. One around sort of per-CP Psi 5.5, this blue 700, and one around APC, right, that red kind of 670. And if I look in my 38-color panel, the combinations of dyes already in those neighborhoods are perfectly usable, right? There's spillover spreading, but this would be manageable through panel design. I could use these colors together. But what happens if I try to add that 39th color to my panel is I introduce really bad spread in these previously usable combinations of colors just by adding an additional fluorochrome. So let's say I make a version A of my 39 color panel where I add VIO R667. Well, now my previously usable combination of Spark 685 and APC looks really bad. This would be really annoying to try and use in my panel, whereas my blue pair was fine. If I make a different version where I add per CP Sci 5.5 instead, well, my red neighborhood is doing okay, but now I've created a spread problem in my blue neighborhood, which is really annoying. So we can make an observation here, right? That spread kind of tends to occur in hotspots depending on the full set of dyes in a panel. So what we're going to do is look at two different cases. We're going to look at dyes in this APC spectral neighborhood, and then we're going to look at dyes in this BB700 spectral neighborhood. And what I'm going to do is look at the unmixing under different conditions. So the first is just unmixing each of these pairs of dyes in the neighborhood with a two-color matrix, so just those two dyes. The second is using panel A, where I've overloaded this red spectral neighborhood. And what I'm going to see is that all three of these pairs of dyes in that neighborhood that were previously usable get really, really bad unmixing-dependent spreading as a result of introducing that third fluorochrome. Whereas my blue neighborhood dyes are still fine. And in my second version, where I add per CP Sci 5.5 and overload this blue spectral neighborhood, I'm going to see really bad UDS in that part of the spectrum, whereas my red dyes are okay. So does similarity scores help us solve this problem? Let me briefly just define what a similarity score is for everyone, because there can be a little bit of confusion sometimes. It's basically a metric that allows us to say how similar two dyes are. It's based on measuring the angle between their spectra, if they're defined as vectors in like a 64 or 78 dimensional space, which is difficult to visualize in PowerPoint. But we can view data for different pairs of dyes in a few different ways, right? So I can look at their spectral signatures. I can look at them as actual vectors in a space here just with 3 detectors, or I can look at the correlation of those values in their spillover matrix. So if I look at nearly identical fluorochromes like FITSI and Alexa 488, these have a very small angle between them and a very high similarity score or cosine similarity. I can look at very similar dyes, but ones that might still be usable. And I can see that, yeah, there's a little bit more of an angle between those two dyes and a little bit less correlation. And then, a pair of dyes that's totally usable, like FITSI and Real Blue 545, there's a pretty wide angle between them. They're readily separable, right? So this is what similarity is talking about. If I look at a matrix of those similarity scores for my panel, what I can do is try and see, okay, which colors have the highest similarity? Are these the ones that have the worst UDS? And if I look at the subset of dyes that have those highest similarity scores, I can see in panel B, the one where I've overloaded that blue neighborhood, that per CP Sci 5.5 and BB700 are in there. They're pretty high. But there's an even higher pair, which is CFluor B532 and BB515. That one has no UDS occurring at all, right? That's a pair of dyes that has really high similarity, but actually has no change in their unmixing performance between a 2-color versus the 39-color panel. Whereas we know that this other pair of dyes that has slightly lower similarity actually has really severe UDS. So similarity is not really perfectly predicting what's going on. I can do things like plot the maximum similarity score for every fluorochrome versus the kind of spillover spreading or how bad that UDS is occurring. And again, I see that there's not really a strong correlation between these. Okay, so maybe this complexity score that a lot of people have a hard time defining can help us solve the problem. To make it clear what this complexity score is, it's a mathematical term called the condition number of the spectral matrix. It is not the sum of similarity scores. So if you take one thing away from this whole talk, complexity is not the sum of similarity scores. And a smaller number is better, but there aren't really hard thresholds. So what I'm showing is another version of that data where we take PE and BB515 and unmix them with panels of different sizes. And I can see that, yeah, there's a relationship between condition number and panel size and spread, but it's kind of hard to define that. If I look across a ton of different randomly generated panels, 10 color, 20 color, 30 color, et cetera, and plot the average UDS versus the complexity score, I can see that there is a relationship there, but it's kind of hard to define what specifically that relationship is. And importantly, complexity score doesn't tell me where the problem is happening. So if I come back to my example panel, the condition number or complexity score for panel A and panel B are almost identical. They're like 69 versus 67. but I know that the hotspot, the problematic area in panel A versus panel B is totally different. Condition number doesn't tell me where the problem is in my panel. So if I kind of sum up the issue, right? Similarity tells me which floors might cause a problem, but not if there actually is a problem. And condition number tells me if there might be a problem, but not where the problem is or how to fix it. So what we need is a way to predict which fluorophores are causing a problem in the context of a specific panel. And that is where this new metric is going to come in. We can basically use this understanding I described earlier, right? That we can map the way that noise goes from raw detector space into our unmixed space. I'm going to skip the math because we're before lunch and I don't want to put anyone through that. But there is an equation that describes how this works for a given unmixing algorithm, and you can calculate it. And it's not too hard to calculate. OK, for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of skip this explanation here. But I did make I made a really good animation. So I have to go through it a little bit. I forgot. You almost got off the hook. So basically, there's a concept that actually shows up in statistics. It's called collinearity, and it describes when two variables or things I'm measuring are almost parallel to each other if plotted as lines, but really it means like they depend on each other too much. They're too intercorrelated. This phenomenon of collinearity is what causes a matrix to have a high complexity score or condition number. And what I'm going to try to do is explain what collinearity means in terms of when we do this unmixing or compensation process, I stretch out my noise too much and cause that high spread. So again, remember that compensation or unmixing is just going from a space where data is correlated to a space where data is not correlated. If I look at a combination of fluorochromes that are not very highly overlapping, right? And I just plot the data for those two detectors for these two fluorochromes, what I'm going to do is show this arrow and I'm going to move it and kind of stretch it out in order to decorrelate my data. And I can see that I didn't have to do very much with this easy pair of fluorochromes. Now I'm going to take a really highly overlapping pair of fluorochromes that has a super high similarity score. And here's my little arrow showing how much I'm going to have to stretch out to make these things orthogonal. We're going to put PowerPoint really to its limits here. But so I was annoyed at this first, but actually this perfectly illustrates the point. When PowerPoint animates something by expanding, it just zooms in on however pixely and gross it looks. That is exactly what is happening when you are unmixing or compensating these highly correlated pairs of dyes. All of that noise that you can just kind of see as like a hairiness in these two raw populations, that gets stretched out when we do this compensation or unmixing, just like my pixely PowerPoint arrow here. And this fundamentally is why high similarity pairs of dyes lead to this high spread when we do compensation or unmixing. But of course, this also happens in 3 dimensions, right? So I'm not going to try to animate this with PowerPoint because that would blow it up. But if I take sort of 3-dimensional raw data, so now we're in the spectral case, in this case for 2 dyes in my panel A, Spark 685 and APC, if I just unmix with this 2-color matrix, no problem. Everything looks really good. Now what I'm going to do is unmix with the presence of my 3rd kind of hotspot crowder, Bio 667. And if I plot these 3 vectors, what you might notice is that they almost all fall in the same plane, which is not good from a geometry perspective. If I have 3 things, they should sort of fill a volume. If they can all start to fit in a 2-dimensional space, that's collinearity. And I'm going to start seeing an issue. And you can imagine as I unmix this, I'm going to be like having to stretch out that 3rd dimension. And in fact, that is what happens. So just by adding this 3rd color that is collinear with the other 2 colors, I start to see this increase in spread in my unmixed data. So that's the geometry of what's happening. And the problem is that similarity and complexity, they hint at when this is happening. Similarity indicates if a pair is collinear, but not a larger combination. Complexity indicates that this collinearity is happening, but doesn't tell me where it's happening. But they aren't enough to specifically identify where the problem is. So to identify this directly, there are other metrics that we can use based on essentially the math that describes how that noise mapping process works. And that is where what we're calling the hotspot matrix comes from. So this is this new metric that can essentially predict where unmixing-dependent spreading is going to happen in the context of a specific panel. I won't go through the math, but it's a pretty simple thing to calculate. It only uses spectral signatures. So just like a similarity score doesn't require you to measure data on your cytometer, All you need is sort of pre-measured spectral signature data, like something that a spectrum viewer provides. And it's purely a function of those spectra. So this doesn't take into account brightness, antigen density, co-expression, et cetera. But what I want to emphasize is that this is a very powerful predictive tool for what the real impact of UDS is in a panel. So if I plot the unmixed standard deviation of my negative population, and then plot just the diagonal entries on that hotspot matrix that correspond to a single fluorochrome, I can see a really, really strong predictive relationship between these two things, right? What I can say is that the simple metric that I just calculated from these spectra is strongly predictive of the true measured spread in my data. So how do we use this tool? Well, essentially the diagonal entries, which I can see along here, they tell me which individual fluorochromes are impacted with the most unmixing spread, that sort of factor by which their standard deviation will increase in this panel. Off-diagonal entries tell me which combinations of those fluorochromes are causing the problem. And so if I look at the hotspot matrix for panel A, what I can see is indeed these off-diagonal entries kind of highlight that crowded red neighborhood. So in just the last couple of minutes I have here, what I want to do is show you how to use this hotspot matrix and how it can be helpful for understanding a panel, and how it kind of rounds out tools already provided like similarity and complexity score. Okay, so first let's look at our examples of panel A and B for my 39 color example. If I look at the similarity scores between these two panels, it would be kind of hard to identify where the specific problem areas are. If I look at the hotspot matrix instead, I can immediately see just through visual inspection that yes, there is a hotspot in my red neighborhood in panel A and a hotspot in this kind of blue 700 and in this case yellow-green 700 area in panel B. And if I look at these, what I'm going to see is that the pairs in my pairs unmixed as pairs versus unmixed as the full panel indeed are correctly predicted by those hotspot values. This even gives me kind of a semi-quantitative way to compare different magnitudes of UDS. So in our red panel, I know that this red hotspot is really bad, but actually I also notice BV510 and amethyst orange are not looking great. And indeed, I do see kind of mild UDS occurring with those two colors, which I may not even have noticed initially. But what I think the cool thing about the hotspot matrix is it gives you a pretty easy way to fix a panel. So if I wanted to go from this panel A that has a really bad hotspot in the red, well, all I'm going to do is pick one of these colors and replace it with a color that doesn't cause a new hotspot. So I'm going to do that. And in this case, when I ran it, just replacing with a Q dot, practical implications aside, I solved the spectral problem and brought my complexity score down by over half. Now I'm just going to look at the next worst hotspot, which was BV510 and amethyst orange. I'm going to replace one of those with a new dye that doesn't create a hotspot. And now I've brought my complexity score down even further. And importantly, there are no obvious hotspots remaining in the panel. So this kind of gives a human algorithm for assessing how to heal a panel that has bad UDS. You just replace the dyes involved in those hotspots with dyes that don't create new hotspots. Okay, I just want to give a quick shout out. This is available to use for free on BD Research Cloud. You can use it as part of the spectral panel design workflow on the FACSymphony A5 SE, FACSDiscover S8, and the Cytec Aurora. We have measured fluor data for a bunch of fluorochromes for all of these, and you can play with this and see how it works. Generally speaking, to interpret, what we're going to see is that hotspot values below 3, you don't really have to worry about. Values between 3 and 8, there's going to be extra UDS there that you need to worry about. And a value above 8 may be usable, but it's going to cause pretty significant spread, and you'll need to factor that into your panel design. Okay, so I think what this does is sort of round out the available tools for thinking about designing very large panels, and can help us identify where UDS is happening at a predictive level before we've even started buying reagents and running them on our instrument. So with that, I'd like to thank the folks at BD who have helped generate a ton of this data and run some experiments to confirm what we showed, as well as collaborators at the Hutch who helped with, or who really led the development of OMIP 102 and are continuing to help work on this. And so thank you very much for your attention. I think we're actually going to go to our roundtable discussion now. We'll go from there. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We're gonna take a few minutes to get set up, so think about your questions. We're gonna make use of these microphones on the sides to ask questions so everyone can hear, and there's so people on YouTube that want to hear your questions. If you don't remember their names, you can just say speaker 1, 2, or 3 who you're addressing a question to, and we'll take it one by one. Rui. Yeah. Oh. Do we have like a video on? Okay. We're waiting on one speaker. You're just very
I guess we
project.
just really project. Okay,
Yeah.
now it sounds like it's.
Testing. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. It's been a great couple of talks here. I'll introduce myself. I'm Matilda Mostrom. I'm a new FlowTex committee member, very excited. And I'm from the Tulane National Primate Research Center. And we're gonna be asking some questions here. This is a room we're open for questions. There's no dumb questions. We're all here to learn. I'd like to ask each of the speakers first before we get to the side questions. You say you have a panel that somebody's telling you to go develop this panel for you. You're kind of familiar with the area, but not quite. What is the first resource by instinct that you just go to first to start developing your panel? I'll start with David.
I'll often start based on experience and start trying to set things up from there. Now, as I said, an easy panel is a couple of colors or separate colors on separate lasers. And then if you start having to add more, then you start pulling in the web-based tools.
Yep.
I mean, some that are familiar with, let's say, the Fortessa or the BD configurations, you can load up your individual octagon, trigon, then immediately go to the opposite channel. So if you've got PE, then jump to PE size 7. But then if you do that in the red, then you've got APC size 7 and PE size 7 with the potential of talking to each other. So you just got to balance it to a point, and then at some point you've got to head to the web if somebody's coming to you with a big panel.
Right. Rui, what about you?
Yeah, I would say it really depends on the size of the panel.
Mhm.
It's a relatively small panel. We'll just, like David was saying, just based on our experience, we can put something together really quickly. The larger the panel, we start using tools like Easy Panel, Fluorofinder. We haven't used particularly, but there are tools out there, right, that can help you build those panels. And then from there, you critically think about all the rules that should be applied and understand if that panel is makes sense or not. But if there's something that already makes sense biologically, and we know that those panels are out there, like in OMIPs and things like that, then we'll go and try to find, I think I've seen a panel like this already developed before, and you go to the literature and you find and you try to, start with those things that have been already established, right, and developed, and then go to our experience and expertise and try to figure out if we can improve that or not.
How about you, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm an engineer. I like cosplay as someone who designs panels occasionally. But I think that for me, the biggest thing I've learned from other folks within BD is have at least a basic sketch of like what your biology is that you care about. What are the populations you're interested in? You have like even just a pseudo gating hierarchy or something that can start to tell you, okay, where am I going to need to think about co-expression? Where do I need to really worry about having a marker that's bright enough to resolve versus just resolve to easy lineage populations. The other one is I really do like this view that has become more popular with Spectral of kind of looking at your lasers versus your emission bands and just sort of starting to lay things out. I think as you're going to anything beyond like this sort of 10 to 12 colors where you can really, there's certain combinations that are just really easy to use. But once you get past that, starting to see where you're going to get sort of neighboring spectral overlap on the same laser versus across lasers, I think is a really effective way to visualize that. And so I found that useful for
good addition. I think we have a question on the right. Here, the microphone works. Otherwise, I'll repeat the question.
So I have a few different items here. So,
Oh.
so for Peter, as a consumer of both Spectral from Cytec and BD, especially the S8, I do appreciate that you've put on non-byte BD instruments on your hotspots. I think it's good for the community. So the comment really, in our experience for Rui though, with your drop-in, we haven't always found that taking optimized panels from Aurora onto PMT-based spectral instruments, let's say, haven't always worked out, mainly in the reg, right? Because the PMT-based instruments you don't get as good resolution over there. So back to Peter. Have you guys, it's all tied together, I promise.
We hear you.
So
Yeah.
it's all tied together. So have you started putting in instruments for your hotspot tool with, let's say, the ID7000 or your symphonies, which are PMT-based instruments into this tool? And is it wildly different?
Yeah, it's a good question. The symphonies are up there. The Spectral Symphony, yeah. So that is available. We would like to add the Sony. We just don't have access to one to generate data on right now. And there are additional systems.
Right next to you.
Yeah, well, it's just true. And there are additional systems coming out, right? So what I would say is, yes, just like similarity scores depend on the specific instrument and optical configuration, you will see differences in hotspot across different instruments. You'll see the same basic trends though, right? So like things that are similar, if you just were to look at them on a spectrometer, they're going to be similar on the instrument. What's interesting, and I think actually useful about this, is that it can help tease out when you're getting to a bigger panel, why a combination of floors works on one system but doesn't on another. And it just provides a really quick way to see that. Complexity score kind of already does that, but doesn't show you where the problem is. So there's an example with OMIP 102 that was developed on the S8 primarily, but we were also sort of trying to run it on the Sony system, and we ended up running a subset on that. But the full set of colors was usable. We looked at it on the Aurora after it was published, and it turns out not really to be runnable on an Aurora just because of kind of incidental slight differences in the filter band edges that make some of the Q dots and BUV dyes sort of impossible to resolve. And that is extremely clear from looking at the hotspot matrix for OMIP 102 on an Aurora versus on these other systems. So that's just an example of where you can kind of see the issue happening. Yeah, I hope that we can add more of those instruments as we go. I'll also point out, you can calculate this yourself from a similarity matrix on any instrument. You can do it in Excel, actually. So I can describe that to you if you'd be interested.
Oh, great. We have some YouTube questions, I believe.
Okay, we have a couple questions on YouTube. The first is from Daniel Vosell, who spoke last year. The first question that he has is, how do you think spectral algorithms will change with the increase in autofluorescent phenotyping? And then kind of related, why don't we include forward and side scatter in spectral unmixing?
I can speak to both of those. I'll speak to the second one first. So that linear mixture model is basically saying that the signal I measure comes from this linear mixture of all of these different components. So that is true for fluorescence. That is not true for forward and side scatter. So we already know that something like forward scatter is not linearly dependent on like size, but more importantly, forward and side scatter don't directly contribute to our fluorescence signals. And so you could add them. They wouldn't really be meaningful. I'd say they're useful when you're doing things like clustering potentially, right? Or doing dimensionality reduction maybe. But they don't really fit into the linear mixture model as it's conceived right now. There may be kind of fancier ways to think about unmixing that could use that information. On the autofluorescence piece, I'll just share it. Typically right now, the way that autofluorescence unmixing works is that you just treat it as an additional set of colors in the unmixing matrix. So you can use whatever unmixing algorithm, OLS or non-OLS methods. There, again, are other more complicated ways of doing unmixing that could treat it differently, but those haven't really been applied in Flow as much yet. I don't know if you guys have thoughts about autofluorescence.
Well, I actually thought of something. I mean, could we actually add these different autofluorescent signatures, calculate if they are hotspots? Because sometimes, you know, the temptation is to use, you know, as many autofluorescent signatures you can find that are different. But then you may be introducing unmixing-dependent spread, right? Just by and we've seen that. We didn't know it was unmixing-dependent spread, but we have seen we introduce an autofluorescent signature that we think is going to really improve the unmixing, and then suddenly we actually have more spread than.
That is, so you absolutely should include any and all autofluorescences in the hotspot matrix. So yes.
I think
There's one more
Hold
from
on. Yep.
from YouTube. Xiaoshuan Fan is asking, sort of like Ben was, how Peter came up with the hotspot formula. So I thought you had plenty of math in there already, but people want more.
Yeah, we can go back to it if anyone wants to stay too much. No, yeah, I mean, so I'll admit that matrix is actually described in some statistics papers in the 80s and even going back farther. I didn't learn that until after we had come up with it through a lot of trial and error, but it was basically looking at the math for how that noise propagates. And then also just observing, if you look at that pseudo inverse matrix, you start to see some weird things when you have these highly overlapping combinations of fluorophores. Like the numbers in that matrix get really, really big, and that looks weird. And so it was just kind of spending too much time looking at all of this stuff, which is part of my job. So I guess that was a good advantage. But yeah, and we do have, there's a paper I'm working on for a while now with Florian and Andrew. It's very, very close to being done. It'll go up as a preprint. So that will be publicly available, and we'll refer back to that literature that we talked about. Yep. Yeah.
Sick.
As a comedic aside, you all did those calculations in your second year of algebra and in high school when you calculated those matrices, and then you wondered, am I ever going to see that again? We've been seeing it all morning.
So I want to ask more contextual questions. This is more for David and Rui. Because of the current funding situation, many people are scrambling and thinking of new ways of doing things. I think panel design is something that can be quite costly, and people are wanting to cut costs in the different areas. I think we want to discuss any tips that can be made up front of reducing costs of panel design to get good panels in the end, because that's what we all want, but doing it cheaply.
Keeping them simple.
Yeah. No, that's again. I mean, this was mentioned here.
You
right?
see from Peter's, the more colors you throw in, the more spread of the data you're going to have to deal with, and it's how far down that rabbit hole do you want to go.
Right.
Yeah. Again, it's been mentioned here. First, understand the biology, right? Just make sure that you use only the markers that are really essential for your research, for many reasons. One, if you put too many, if you're adding colors, you're just adding more complexity. You're going to impact the quality of your panel, but you may be wasting a lot of money. Another tool that I think is very interesting that's been added with spectral flow cytometry is the library function. And I think we need to be careful how to use it. We can use it badly and actually have worse data, but I think it's very useful in the sense that you can save a lot of money in running single state controls and time. I mean, one of our biggest bottleneck in terms of doing all these experiments, testing different panels, etc., is running the single state controls. It takes a lot of time. Right. The bigger the panel it is. And so again, we're spending a lot of money in just staining single state controls, something that if we can have it in the library and just apply, saves a lot of time and money. So that's one thing I would, if that works.
If that
Right.
works. I've had that discussion with Sony. They said, oh, we can put all of the Spectral in the computer and have it automatically done, and you technically don't need to have your, you know, you have to run all your single color controls. But then if you ask if you have that, what I'll call lovingly the lab mate from hell, that you come in the morning and it's a thawed ice bucket and your conjugates are, your conjugates are laying in a thawed ice bucket. Is that compensation setting now going to be what's in the machine's library? So
Yeah, we're doing biology and like these reagents aren't always the same.
yeah,
Or the vendors, different lot numbers, new shipments, they didn't make changes.
Yeah, that also the fact that, I mean, we're still learning
Yeah.
a lot. I mean, Peter's just presenting here tools that are extremely useful, but it really shows that we're still learning a lot of the, you know, how different things impact the quality of our data. And so we're still exploring it a lot.
Mhm.
So in terms of cutting costs, there's always that balance in I really want to explore in depth and make sure that I get the best out of this data versus, okay, I'm just going to apply standard
Right.
practices and hope that it works.
Mhm.
So I think we're still in that phase that we still need to spend a lot of money
Right.
to figure things out.
So one thing I'll just say, coming from a vendor perspective, right? Like we want you to do the kind of minimum amount of biology you need to do your biology, right? So it's not just pushing bigger panels or running more reagents. The other thing I'll say is these spectral instruments, like you mentioned, Rui, they're starting to become a lot more standardized within each platform. So these cloud-based tools, things like FluoroFinder, BDRC, EasyPanel, et cetera, like if you have an Aurora or if you have an S8 or you have an ID7000, you can get a pretty good sense for how these fluorochromes are going to behave together just by looking at that publicly available data. And so it's not like, oh, I need to order all these things and then see how they unmix together for your final panel for sure. But you can start to figure out a lot of where those problems are going to be just with the cloud tools, which can also save some reagents up front.
Is there?
I have a question about like as a core facility manager, I think it's relatively easy, if not right now, at least with little bit practice, for me to learn to use these online tools and give advice to the customers. But they are mostly meant for selecting which fluorophores to use together, which we can combine and which we cannot combine. But how much, like, I'm not really expert on the question that the customer has. And so how important is to choose which antibody to conjugate to that color? So I think the tools are good selecting 30 colors that work together, but I'm not the expert to tell the customers which CD marker to put on which 30 colors. How important is that when you try to make a big panel?
I would say it's crucial. Very important. I mean, that's one of the reasons, at least, you know, I was lucky. We have the resources to hire people with that type of expertise. I'm not an immunologist. I worked in an immunology lab for a couple of years, but I don't feel I have that expertise. And so I thought it was important to bring that expertise. And but I would say for other cores, if you don't have that expertise, find it. You know, go to the literature, read the papers, and be more aware of the biology, because I think that's absolutely crucial. And even the expertise in staining, you know, different clones that work well in certain cases and in other cases don't work. So having that knowledge, I think, is really important.
I think we have a question here on the left from Midi.
Yeah, that's a great question. And for
Can you
anyone
repeat the
who,
question for the sound?
exactly. Anyone who couldn't hear the question is, would you see these same unmixing-dependent spreading effects happening in a compensation-based experiment? And yes, the answer is you would if you were using these problematic, really overlapping combinations in a conventional experiment. Same thing will show up. So that paper from Mario's lab from 2015 was basically showing that in the context of dealing with autofluorescence. But the exact same thing will happen. You just won't tend to run into it because compensation or conventional systems steer you away from using those combinations of fluorochromes because you would sort of have two dyes that have the same primary detector, and it starts to get a little weird. But I guarantee people have run into this for a long time on conventional systems and just probably were like, well, I'm going to go home today because this isn't working.
We can repeat it.
That's okay. We'll
later.
repeat it for you. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. So whether the use of like a dump channel affects this or can help it, the answer is it's kind of complicated. So if you are using a dump channel, and so say you have viability in a channel that doesn't overlap with any other fluorochromes, and you're just going to gate it out. In that case, you could do kind of a traditional dump channel where you just say, gate everything out that's positive in this raw detector, and then unmix or compensate with a matrix excluding that on everything that remains. And that would work. A lot of, at least instrument software, it's a little challenging to like apply one matrix to a subset of your events. Usually it's at the whole recording level, although I don't know if that's probably not true for all vendors. So it just more becomes like your workflow. It might be challenging to do that. But in principle, yes. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, it's not going to be so easy to cleanly gate out something like that on a raw detector. So then you do end up still including it in the unmixing matrix. But it is a case for having like a pan lineage single fluorochrome. So if you have, CD19 and CD16 and whatever, all in the same color, and you're just going to exclude those, that's great because then you're not sort of penalizing your matrix with extra fluorochromes that you don't need. Yeah.
Meredith we'll take one last question, then we're gonna go on lunch.
I guess I just want to quickly ask the three of you to touch base on how picking the proper controls, as in beads versus cells, different brands of beads, plays into your panel design and how important you think it is, because some of us think it's very important.
Yeah. You want to start, David, or right, Peter?
I intentionally avoided that topic this morning because I didn't want to open that Pandora's box, but it comes down to whether or not we can try to work both at the same time, because sometimes I always tell customers, your best compensation control is going to be your cellular-based control. But usually the color, the marker they're interested in is usually the dimmest. So it's how to work that. And of course, for those that don't know, the problem is the freaking Alzheimer's. Refractive index of your negative bead is not the same as the negative cell, and that can throw things off. So.
What was the question?
I'm
joking.
Beads.
No, I'm joking.
Beads.
We just had ran a spectral workshop together where, this is probably one of the most important things that we ran into. So it's definitely very important, and it's very easy. We even saw things like if you leave BV786 just a few minutes outside of the, exposed to light, or just exposed to we were debating whether, it was the beads in particular. It seems that ultracomp beads with polymer dyes, there is some interaction that maybe is changing the conformation of the dye when it's bound to the bead with the antibody. We don't really know what the mechanism is, but there's definitely issues there. And so it's very easy to just, if you don't control your single stain controls properly, not allowing them to be exposed to light, maintaining the right temperature, even then you might see changes when you stain the cells versus when you stain the beads. So the problem may not be just occurring in the beads, maybe also occurring in the cells, and there you need the right cellular control for that. So I wonder also, even if you're using different tissues, just as single stain controls to get maybe for a not so expressed marker, you're trying to get a tissue where that expression is high. that may be also different, or you may see differences between those controls and the sample. So I think, again, this is one of the things that a lot of us are still exploring, trying to identify not the mechanisms per se, but at least where there are problems and where there aren't, and how can we fix them. But there's still a lot to explore, right? We're still not sure which are the right controls to use. And by the way, they may change from time to time. We've seen that from day to day. Sometimes the cellular control is better. Sometimes the bead control is better. So it's, yeah.
Yeah, it happens all the time, seeing unmixing errors from some issue with the control. I would say plan for this part carefully. It's not an afterthought. So just like you're planning your panel and your experiment to not waste precious sample or precious reagent, also plan your control strategy. And there are some like current protocols papers on different approaches to doing this. But it's really important, and it sucks getting to the end of a big experiment and finding one comp issue or unmixing error that you can't fix because like a PE tandem broke down over the course of running the experiment. And so, you get into, do I need to do manual and mixing correction, et cetera? There are approaches to dealing with this, but like come up with a plan and execute it, and give yourself more flexibility if it's running separate bead and cell controls for your really dim biological markers or ones may have a bigger issue. Even doing some simple things like once you're done running your controls and you're running your fully stained sample, rerun some of those same controls to see if they've been breaking down over time and see if there's an issue. So it should be something that the vendors come up with an automated solution for, and hopefully we can at some point. It's not quite there yet. So unfortunately, the onus is on you to really plan and account for this, because you don't want to get to the end of an experiment and have those issues there.
I think that's a great way to end up the roundtable. So we'll give the speakers an applause. Thank you very much. Okay. So next we're moving to lunch, and we have lunch for everyone. And there's both vegan, vegetarian, dairy restrictions that we've placed orders for. So if you do have a allergy, please go early. So pick that. If you don't have one, please sign up, pick a restricted meal until more people have picked up food. Thank you, everyone. We'll be back in the afternoon.
I just want to quick thank our lunch sponsor too. Today's lunch is sponsored by
Today's lunch sponsor.
Sponsored by Core Quantum Technologies.
Yes.
Thank you to them for a little
Thank you
bit
to
of
Core